Sometimes grief makes us do things that look crazy to everyone else. When Frank Delaney spent his son's college fund on a crumbling airport, his whole town turned against him. The local news called him a fool. His neighbors whispered behind his back. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his late wife was trying to tell him something through his dreams. So he picked up his tools and started clearing the overgrown runways by himself. That's when strange things began happening. Radio broadcasts from an empty control tower, runway lights flickering without electricity, hidden blueprints from the Cold War era. What Frank discovered buried beneath that forgotten airport was worth over $200 million. But the real treasure wasn't money. It was the truth about his family's hidden past and a chance to honor heroes the world had forgotten. When powerful developers showed up with bulldozers and threats, Frank had to make the hardest choice of his life. What would you risk to uncover a secret that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Main Street in Millbrook, Ohio, a town that had forgotten how to dream. Frank Delaney stood in the doorway of his garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen too many years of honest work. At 53, he carried himself like a man who had learned that life could break you in ways you never expected, but that you kept going anyway because giving up wasn't an option when you had people counting on you. His garage sat between Murphy's Hardware, which had been closing early for the past 6 months, and what used to be Henderson's Five and Dime, before it became another empty storefront with soap-streaked windows. The whole downtown looked like a mouth with missing teeth, gaps where prosperity used to smile. Frank had watched this slow decline for years, but it had accelerated after the plant closures. Young folks packed up and headed for Columbus or Cincinnati, leaving behind the older generation to tend a garden that seemed determined to return to wilderness. "Dad, you've got Mrs. Patterson's Buick making that noise again." Danny's voice carried from inside the garage, tinged with the particular brand of teenage exasperation that Frank remembered from his own youth. At 17, Danny had inherited his mother's quick mind and his father's stubborn streak, though Frank suspected the boy got a double dose of the latter. Frank stepped back into the familiar embrace of motor oil and metal, where problems had solutions and hard work usually paid off. Danny was bent over the Buick's engine, his dark hair falling across his forehead, the same way Sarah's used to when she concentrated on her crossword puzzles. The resemblance still caught Frank off guard sometimes, a sweet ache that he'd learned to carry like an old injury that predicted rain. "Alternators going?" Danny said without looking up, "but she's not going to want to hear that." "No," Frank agreed, pulling on his work gloves. "She's going to want to hear it's a $5 fix that'll last another 10 years. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that comes between people who understand each other's rhythms. Frank had taught Danny everything about engine show to listen to them, how to feel what they needed, how to coax life from worn parts that anyone else would have thrown away. It was the kind of knowledge that passed from father to son, like an inheritance, practical wisdom that couldn't be learned from books. The bell above the garage door chimed, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. She was pushing 80, but moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world that wasn't always kind to elderly Chinese women in small Ohio towns. Frank had known her for 20 years, ever since she'd moved to Millbrook to be closer to her daughter. Her husband had passed the year before Sarah did, and they'd bonded over the shared understanding of what it meant to wake up each morning to an empty house. "You boys need to eat," she said, setting the plate on Frank's workbench. "Real food, not whatever you've been living on." Frank lifted the foil to reveal homemade dumplings, still warm. The gesture was typical of Mrs. Chen's practical kindness, delivered without fuss or expectation of thanks. In a town where people were increasingly isolated by their own struggles, she remained stubbornly generous. "You don't need to keep feeding us," Frank said, though he was already reaching for one of the dumplings. "I need to keep cooking," she replied. "Too much food for one person. Besides, Sarah would haunt me if I let you waste away." The mention of Sarah's name settled over them like dust in afternoon light. It had been 2 years since cancer had taken her, 2 years since Frank's world had reorganized itself around the absence at its center. He still wore his wedding ring, still kept her coffee mug in the cabinet, still sometimes reached for the phone to call her when something interesting happened. Grief, he'd learned, wasn't something you got over. It was something you got used to carrying. Danny had taken his mother's death differently, retreating into schoolwork and part-time jobs with the single-minded focus of someone trying to outrun sorrow. He'd grown serious beyond his years, worried about college applications and scholarships, with an intensity that reminded Frank of Sarah planning their wedding, determined to control every detail because some things in life were too important to leave to chance. "College letters should start coming soon," Mrs. Chen said, as if reading Frank's thoughts. She had a talent for knowing what people were thinking, probably from years of watching human nature unfold across her kitchen table. Danny straightened up from the engine, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Got accepted to Ohio State last week. Engineering program." Frank felt a surge of pride mixed with something that might have been panic. Ohio State meant Danny would be gone, meant the garage would be quiet, meant Frank would be truly alone for the first time since Sarah got sick. He'd been saving every spare dollar for Danny's education, working weekends and holidays, taking on jobs other mechanics wouldn't touch. The boy's future was the one thing Frank felt he could still control. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, and Frank could hear genuine joy in her voice. Sarah would be so proud. Danny's expression softened at the mention of his mother. Even now, 2 years later, he still looked for her approval in the empty spaces where she used to be. Frank recognized the habit because he did it too, making decisions based on what Sarah would have wanted, keeping faith with a love that death couldn't quite erase. The afternoon wore on with the steady rhythm of work. Frank replaced Mrs. Patterson's alternator, while Danny handled an oil change on Pete Morrison's pickup. Pete owned the diner down the street and had been coming to Frank for automotive advice since before Danny was born. He was one of the few business owners who'd managed to keep his doors open, mainly because people always needed somewhere to drink coffee and complain about their troubles. Around 4 o'clock, Pete himself wandered over, drawn by the smell of Mrs. Chen's dumplings and the prospect of avoiding the dinner rush preparation for another 10 minutes. "Heard Rodriguez down at the bank is getting pressure from his bosses again," Pete said, settling onto an overturned crate that served as the garage's unofficial conversation spot. More talk about consolidating branches. Frank tightened a bolt with more force than necessary. Rodriguez had been pressuring him about the mortgage on the garage, suggesting it might be time to consider selling and moving somewhere with better opportunities. As if opportunities were something you could pack in a suitcase and carry from place to place. "Man's just doing his job," Frank said, though he didn't sound convinced. "His job is keeping people in their homes, not pushing them out," Pete replied. "Sometimes I think these bank people forget we're not just numbers on a spreadsheet." Danny looked up from the oil change. "Maybe we should consider it, Dad. The garage isn't exactly making us rich." Frank felt something tighten in his chest. The garage was more than a business. It was the place where he'd built his life with Sarah, where she'd brought him lunch on slow afternoons, where Danny had taken his first steps between the tool bench and the hydraulic lift. Selling would be like admitting that the life they'd built here didn't matter anymore. "This place has been good to us," Frank said quietly. "Your mother painted those walls. You learned to work on these floors. Some things are worth more than money." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. She understood the weight of place, the way certain locations held the shape of the people who'd loved them. Her own house was full of furniture that had belonged to her late husband, rooms arranged exactly as they'd been when he was alive. As the day wound down, Frank walked through his house with the careful attention of someone conducting inventory. The living room still held Sarah's reading chair, positioned to catch the best light from the western window. Her bookmarks still protruded from half-finished novels, marking places she'd never returned to. The kitchen counter displayed her collection of ceramic roosters, each one a small celebration of domestic happiness that now seemed to mock the silence. In the bedroom, Frank sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the wooden toolbox where he kept his most important possessions. Inside, beneath insurance papers and the deed to the house, lay Sarah's photo album. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages held the visual history of their 23 years together. Wedding pictures where they both looked impossibly young. Danny's first steps, first day of school, high school graduation, Sarah's last birthday, where she'd insisted on making her own cake, despite the chemotherapy fatigue. Frank turned the pages slowly, allowing himself to remember when their future had stretched out ahead of them like an open road. They'd planned to travel after Danny graduated, maybe visit Sarah's cousins in California, or take that cruise to Alaska she'd always talked about. Instead, he was left with photographs and the persistent ache of unfinished conversations. Danny appeared in the doorway, hesitant in the way teenagers get when they want to talk about something important but don't know how to begin. "You okay, Dad?" Frank closed the album carefully. "Just thinking about your mother. She'd be proud of you getting into Ohio State." "She'd be worried about the money," Danny said, settling into the chair by the window. "You know how she was about debt." Frank did know. Sarah had kept their household budget in a spiral notebook, tracking every expense with the devotion of someone who'd grown up understanding that money was something you held on to because you never knew when it might run out. She would have found a way to pay for Danny's education without borrowing, probably by working extra shifts at the hospital where she'd been a nurse. "We'll manage," Frank said. "That's what people do. They manage." Danny studied his father's face in the lamplight. "Sometimes I wonder what she'd think about us now, whether we're doing okay without her." The question hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. Frank wondered the same thing every day. Were they honoring Sarah's memory or just going through the motions of living? Were they building something meaningful or just marking time until they could be with her again? "I think she'd want us to be happy," Frank finally said, "but I think she'd understand that happiness takes time to find again." Outside, Millbrook settled into evening quiet. Streetlights flickered on along Main Street, illuminating empty sidewalks and closed storefronts. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the flat Ohio countryside, carrying its cargo toward places where people still believed in the possibility of something better. Frank returned the photo album to its place in the toolbox, next to the small velvet box that held Sarah's engagement ring. He'd never been able to bring himself to put it away permanently, but he couldn't bear to see it sitting on her dresser either. So it lived in the toolbox with the other treasures, too precious to display, but too important to discard. As he prepared for bed, Frank found himself thinking about dreams. Not the ambitious kind that young people chase, but the quiet dreams that come in sleep, the ones where the dead visit the living and sometimes try to tell them things they need to know. Lately, Sarah had been appearing more frequently in his dreams, always in places he didn't recognize, always accompanied by a man in a vintage pilot's uniform who seemed familiar but whose face Frank could never quite remember upon waking. The pilot never spoke, but Sarah always seemed to be trying to tell Frank something important, something urgent. She'd point toward distant horizons or gesture at objects Frank couldn't quite see clearly. When he woke, he was left with the frustrating sense that he'd missed something crucial, like arriving at a movie theater just as the important scene was ending. Tonight, as Frank settled into the empty bed that still smelled faintly of Sarah's perfume, he found himself hoping the dreams would come again. Maybe this time he'd understand what she was trying to tell him. Maybe this time he'd be smart enough to listen. Outside his window, the night settled over Millbrook like a blanket pulled up to a sleeper's chin. In a few hours, another day would begin, bringing with it the familiar routines of work and worry, the steady progression of ordinary life in a town that time seemed to be forgetting. But in the space between waking and sleeping, in the realm where love transcends death and the impossible sometimes feels within reach, Frank Delaney prepared to receive whatever message his wife might have for him. He closed his eyes and waited for morning, or for dreams, whichever came first. Frank hadn't planned to attend the county auction. He'd driven past the courthouse that Saturday morning on his way to pick up parts for Mrs. Patterson's Buick, when he noticed the crowd gathered around the auctioneer's podium. Something about the scene drew him in. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing above the assembled bidders, or maybe it was simply the human need to witness other people's endings. The auctioneer, a thin man, with a voice that carried across the courthouse square like a carnival barker's, was working his way through a collection of farm equipment and household goods. Frank recognized some of the items from the Henderson place the family had finally given up fighting the bank and moved to Florida to live with their daughter. It was a story that had become depressingly common in Millbrook. Frank found himself standing next to Pete Morrison, who was eyeing a restaurant-grade coffee maker with the calculating look of a man who spent most of his profits on equipment repairs. "Didn't expect to see you here," Pete said without taking his eyes off the auction block. "Didn't expect to be here," Frank replied, "just passing through." The auctioneer moved on to larger items, and Frank was about to leave when he heard the words that would change everything. "Next up, we have Millbrook Municipal Airport, a 37-acre property including runways, hangar facilities, and control tower. Bidding starts at $15,000. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, like a gear clicking into place. The airport. He hadn't thought about it in years, but suddenly he could picture it perfectly the way it had looked when he was 12 years old, and his father had taken him there to watch the crop dusters fuel up. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. The smell of aviation fuel, the sound of propeller engines warming up, the sense that the whole world was spread out beyond those runways waiting to be explored. 15,000. "Do I hear 15? The auctioneer called. A man in an expensive suit raised his hand. Frank recognized him as one of the developers who'd been circling Millbrook like vultures, buying up property for strip malls and chain restaurants. Behind him stood two other men, in similar suits, all of them wearing the confident expressions of people who were used to getting what they wanted. 15,000 to the gentleman in the blue suit. "Do I hear 20? Frank found his hand rising before his brain could stop it. 20,000 to the gentleman in the work shirt. "Do I hear 25? Pete turned to stare at Frank with the expression of someone watching a friend step in front of a moving truck. "Frank, what are you doing?" Frank didn't answer because he didn't know. All he knew was that something deep in his chest was telling him the airport belonged to him, that he was supposed to have it, that Sarah had been trying to tell him about it in those dreams where she stood beside the vintage Pilot. The bidding escalated quickly. 25 became 30. 30 became 35. The developers seemed annoyed, but not particularly concerned. They were probably used to outbidding locals who got sentimental about old buildings. Frank could feel Danny's college fund burning a hole in his mental pocket, could hear Sarah's voice warning him about making impulsive decisions. But he kept bidding anyway. At $50,000, one of the developers dropped out. At 60, the second one followed suit. It was down to Frank and the man in the blue suit, who was now looking at Frank with the kind of irritation reserved for insects that refuse to be swatted. 70,000, Frank called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The developer conferred with his associates, their heads bent together in urgent whispers. Finally, he straightened up and nodded to the auctioneer. 75,000. Frank closed his eyes and saw Sarah standing in a field he didn't recognize, pointing towards something beyond the horizon. The pilot beside her nodded encouragingly, as if he understood something Frank hadn't figured out yet. 100,000, Frank said. The crowd fell silent. $100,000 was serious money in Millbrook, the kind of money that represented years of careful saving or desperate borrowing. The developer's confident expression cracked slightly around the edges. 110, the developer countered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Frank thought about Danny's acceptance letter to Ohio State, about the scholarship applications they'd filled out together, about the future he'd promised his son. Then he thought about Sarah's face in his dreams, about the urgency in her expression, about the feeling that something important was waiting for him at that airport. 125,000, Frank said quietly. The developer threw up his hands and walked away, muttering something about crazy locals and bad investments. The auctioneer called for other bidders twice more, but the crowd had gone quiet, everyone staring at Frank as if he'd just announced his intention to fly to the moon. Sold for $125,000 to bidder number 47. Frank stood there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. He had just spent Danny's entire college fund on 37 acres of cracked asphalt and abandoned buildings. He had made the most impulsive, irrational decision of his life, and he couldn't explain why it felt like the rightest thing he'd ever done. The paperwork took an hour. Frank signed his name to documents that transferred ownership of Millbrook Municipal Airport from the county to Frank Delaney, private citizen and apparent lunatic. The clerk who processed the transaction kept giving him concerned looks, as if she expected him to suddenly come to his senses and demand his money back. By the time Frank drove home, word had already spread through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. Mrs. Chen was waiting on his front porch, her face a mask of polite concern that didn't quite hide her bewilderment. "Frank," she said carefully, "Pete Morrison called me. He said you bought the airport." "I did," Frank replied, surprising himself with how normal his voice sounded. "With what money?" Frank sat down on the porch steps beside her. "Danny's college fund." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to judge other people's decisions too quickly. Finally she asked, "Why?" "I don't know," Frank admitted. "I just had to." When Danny came home from his job at the grocery store, he found Frank sitting at the kitchen table with the deed to the airport spread out in front of him. The boy took one look at his father's face and knew something had changed. "Dad, what's wrong?" Frank told him about the auction, about the bidding war, about the moment when everything else had fallen away except the certainty that he needed to own that piece of land. He watched his son's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of devastated anger that Frank had never seen before. "You spent my college money," Danny said slowly, "on an abandoned airport." "Yes." "Without talking to me about it." "Yes." Danny stood there for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, looking like he was trying to decide whether to scream or cry. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled in a way that was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Mom would have talked to me first," he said. "Mom would never have thrown away my future for some crazy impulse." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Danny was right, of course. Sarah would have sat them both down at this same kitchen table, would have made lists and considered alternatives, would have found a way to honor whatever instinct was driving Frank without sacrificing their son's education. But Sarah wasn't here, and Frank was making decisions based on dreams and feelings he couldn't explain to a rational 17-year-old who had every right to be furious. "I know it doesn't make sense," Frank said. "I know it looks crazy. But something is telling me this is important, that your mother is trying to tell me something through these dreams." "Dreams?" Danny's voice cracked slightly. "You bankrupted our family because of dreams." That night, Frank lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering what he had done. Danny hadn't spoken to him since their conversation in the kitchen, had eaten dinner in silence, and gone to his room without saying goodnight. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of Frank's decision was pressing down on all of them. But when he finally fell asleep, Sarah was waiting for him in the dream. She was standing beside the vintage Pilot on a hill overlooking the airport, and for the first time, she was smiling. The Pilot tipped his cap to Frank in a gesture that seemed to say, "Well done," and Sarah mouthed words that Frank couldn't quite hear, but somehow understood. When he woke up, Frank knew he had made the right choice, even if he couldn't explain it to anyone else. The airport was calling him, and Sarah had been trying to point him toward it all along. Whatever secrets lay buried in those abandoned runways and forgotten hangars, Frank was going to find them, even if it cost him everything else he had left. The story broke on the local news 3 days after the auction. Frank was working under the hood of Deputy Miller's patrol car when Pete burst through the garage doors, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been panic. "Frank, you need to see this," Pete said, brandishing his phone like evidence at a crime scene. Channel 8 just ran a story about you. They're calling you the airport dreamer. Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag and accepted the phone. The news story was worse than he'd imagined. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a tone of barely concealed mockery, stood in front of the airport gates while describing Frank's shocking impulse purchase of the abandoned aviation facility. She interviewed several townspeople, including Councilman Bradley, who expressed concern about Frank's mental state and suggested the purchase might be grounds for a psychiatric evaluation. The worst part was the footage of Frank himself, captured by someone's cell phone during the auction. He looked wild-eyed and desperate, his hand shooting up to bid with the jerky movements of a man possessed. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Local mechanic spends son's college fund on derelict airport." "They make me look like I've lost my mind," Frank said, handing the phone back to Pete. "Have you?" Pete asked gently. Before Frank could answer, the garage door chimed, and Rodriguez walked in. The banker looked uncomfortable, his usual polished confidence replaced by the awkward demeanor of someone delivering bad news to a friend. "Frank, we need to talk," Rodriguez said, glancing at Pete with obvious reluctance. Pete took the hint and made himself scarce, muttering something about checking on the coffee at the diner. When they were alone, Rodriguez pulled out a manila folder and set it on Frank's workbench. "The bank is concerned about your recent financial decisions," Rodriguez began carefully. "Given the substantial withdrawal from your savings account and the unusual nature of the purchase, my supervisors are questioning your ability to maintain your existing loan obligations." Frank felt his jaw tighten. "My mortgage payments are current." "Yes, but you've depleted your liquid assets. If something happened to the garage and equipment failure, a liability claim, a drop in business, you'd have no cushion. The bank needs assurance that you can meet your obligations." Rodriguez opened the folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I've prepared some preliminary documents for a property assessment. If you're serious about this airport venture, you'll need to demonstrate its viability as collateral, or we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements for your existing loans." Frank stared at the papers without picking them up. Alternative arrangements. In banker speak, that meant foreclosure procedures, payment restructuring, or forced sale. Rodriguez was giving him a polite warning that his financial house of cards was about to collapse. "How long do I have?" Frank asked. 60 days to provide a business plan or feasibility study for the airport property. After that, we'll need to review all your accounts." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "Frank, I've known you for 10 years. You're a good man, but this airport thing has people worried. Maybe it's time to consider cutting your losses." After Rodriguez left, Frank sat alone in his garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and machinery that had been his livelihood for 2 decades. For the first time since the auction, he allowed himself to truly consider what he had done. He'd spent his son's college fund on property he'd never seen, up close, driven by dreams and impulses he couldn't explain to anyone, including himself. But that evening, instead of going home to face Danny's cold silence, Frank drove out to the airport. The chain-link fence around the property was rusted but intact, topped with coils of wire that had lost their sharpness to years of weather. Frank had the key now, heavy brass thing that looked like it belonged to a medieval castlehand. He unlocked the gate with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation or dread. The main runway stretched out before him like a concrete river, cracked and sprouting weeds but still holding the ghost of its original purpose. Frank walked down the centerline, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence, and tried to imagine what this place had been like in its prime. The hangar loomed ahead of him, a massive steel structure that seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if tired from holding itself upright for so many years. Inside the hangar, Frank found the remnants of aviation history. Old oil stains mapped the floor where aircraft had once been serviced. Tool benches lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by decades of use. In one corner, he discovered a small office with windows that looked out over the runway. The desk was still there, along with filing cabinets and a wooden chair that creaked when Frank tested its stability. It was in the bottom drawer of the desk that Frank found the first clue that his purchase might not have been as crazy as everyone thought. Tucked behind a collection of old maintenance logs was a small cardboard box, and inside the box was a bronze star medal, tarnished with age but still bearing the clear inscription, "For heroic achievement, Thomas Kowalski, 1953. Frank turned the medal over in his hands, feeling its weight. The name meant nothing to him, but something about finding it here, in this forgotten place, felt significant. He slipped the medal into his jacket pocket and continued exploring. The control tower was accessible via a narrow staircase that Frank climbed with careful steps, testing each rung for safety. At the top, he found a small room lined with windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire airport complex. The radio equipment was still there, ancient but somehow dignified, like an elderly gentleman in a faded suit. When Frank flipped what looked like a power switch, nothing happened, but he hadn't really expected it to. As the sun set behind the hangar, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank stood at the control tower windows and tried to imagine what Sarah had been trying to tell him. The pilot in his dreams always stood beside her, pointing toward this place, as if it held answers to questions Frank hadn't thought to ask. When he finally drove home, Frank found Danny waiting in the kitchen, homework spread across the table like accusations. The boy looked up when his father entered, and Frank saw something different in his expression. Not forgiveness, but perhaps a willingness to listen. "I went to the airport today," Frank said. Danny set down his pencil. "And? It's not just a pile of concrete and steel. There's history there. Someone cared about that place once." Frank pulled the bronze star from his pocket and set it on the table between them. "I found this in a desk drawer. Someone named Thomas Kowalski earned this for heroic achievement." Danny picked up the medal, studying it with the careful attention he usually reserved for engine components. "Why would someone leave this behind?" "Maybe they didn't leave it behind," Frank said. "Maybe they hid it there for someone to find." For the first time since the auction, father and son sat together without the weight of anger between them. The medal seemed to bridge some gap, offering the possibility that Frank's impulse purchase might have been guided by something more than madness. Outside, Millbrook settled into another quiet evening, but inside the Delaney kitchen, two people were beginning to believe that some mysteries were worth solving, even if the cost was higher than they could afford to pay. Frank began spending his evenings at the airport, arriving after closing the garage and staying until darkness made further work impossible. He'd equipped himself with basic tools, a push mower he'd bought second-hand, pruning shears, trash bags, and a crowbar for the more stubborn obstacles that time and neglect had created. The work was methodical and oddly soothing. Frank would start at one end of the property and work his way across, clearing weeds, picking up debris, and slowly revealing the bones of what had once been a functioning airport. With each day, the place looked a little more like it was supposed to, and Frank felt a corresponding sense of rightness that he couldn't explain to anyone else. It was during his third week of evening maintenance that Frank discovered the basement level beneath the main hangar. He'd been trying to move a heavy workbench when he noticed that the concrete floor sounded hollow in one particular spot. Further investigation revealed a seam in the floor, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, and a recessed handle that took considerable effort to lift. The stairs descended into darkness that his flashlight could barely penetrate. The air below was stale but dry, suggesting the space had been well sealed against moisture. Frank descended carefully, his footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, until he reached a room that took his breath away. The basement was larger than the hangar above it, stretching out beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. Along the walls, Frank could make out the shapes of equipment covered in canvas tarps. When he pulled back one of the coverings, he found a radio setup that looked like something from a Cold War movie, vacuum tubes and switches and dials, labeled with technical specifications that were beyond his understanding. But it was the desk in the center of the room that captured Frank's attention. It was smaller than the one upstairs, more personal somehow, and when Frank settled into the chair behind it, he felt like he was sitting in someone's secret command center. The drawers were locked, but Frank's crowbar made quick work of the old mechanism. Inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in oiled leather, Frank found a logbook. The cover was embossed with the name Captain James Morrison and filled with entries dating from 1951 to 1962. Frank opened it carefully, treating the aged pages like archaeological artifacts. The entries were cryptic but intriguing. Morrison wrote about cargo runs and special deliveries, about flights that departed at odd hours and landed at airfields that weren't marked on any civilian maps. There were references to the package and the professor, and coordinates that seemed to lead to locations all over the Midwest. One entry, dated November 15, 1953, caught Frank's attention. Package delivered to TK as arranged. Professor confirms receipt and storage in designated location. Payment complete. This should be the last run for this particular cargo, but TK insists on maintaining security protocols indefinitely. Sometimes I think he knows something the rest of us don't. TK Thomas Kowalski, the name on the Bronze Star. Frank was beginning to understand that his airport had been involved in something more complicated than civilian aviation. He photographed several pages of the logbook with his phone, then rewrapped it carefully and returned it to the drawer. As he climbed back up to the hangar level, Frank's mind was racing with possibilities. What kind of cargo required such secrecy? What was significant enough that a war hero like Kowalski would dedicate years of his life to protecting it? When Frank arrived home that night, he found Danny waiting with a manila envelope and an expression that fell somewhere between excitement and apprehension. "Scholarship letter from Ohio State," Danny explained, holding up the envelope. "Haven't opened it yet." Frank studied his son's face. "Why not?" "Because if I got it, I can still go to college despite what you did. And if I didn't get it, then your airport purchase really did ruin my future." Danny turned the envelope over in his hands. "Either way, everything changes after I open this." Frank sat down at the kitchen table. "Want me to open it?" "No." Danny took a deep breath and tore open the envelope with the decisive motion of someone removing a bandage. He read silently for a moment, his expression unreadable, then set the letter down on the table. "I got it," he said quietly. "Partial scholarship. Covers about 60% of tuition." Frank felt relief wash over him like a wave. Danny could still go to college. The airport purchase hadn't completely destroyed his son's future, even if it had made things more complicated. "That's wonderful," Frank said, reaching for the letter. Danny pulled it back. "Is it? Because now I have to decide whether to take on massive debt for the remaining 40% or whether to stay here and help you figure out what the hell you've gotten us into." The question hung between them like a challenge. Frank wanted to tell Danny to take the scholarship and run, to build a life far away from Millbrook and his father's inexplicable impulses. But he also wanted his son's help in solving the mystery that was growing more intriguing by the day. "I found something at the airport tonight," Frank said, pulling out his phone to show Danny the photographs of Morrison's logbook. Evidence that the place was used for more than just civilian flights. Danny studied the images with the focused attention he brought to complex mechanical problems. This Captain Morrison guy was running some kind of smuggling operation. Or intelligence work. Look at the dates, early 50s, height of the Cold War. And remember the medal I found belonged to Thomas Kowalski. What are the odds that's a coincidence? They spent the next hour researching on Danny's laptop, cross-referencing names and dates, and trying to piece together a story from fragments of information. Morrison's obituary described him as a decorated veteran and civilian pilot, but gave no details about his wartime service. Kowalski was even more mysterious. No obituary, no military records, no trace of him after 1953. "It's like he just disappeared," Danny said, scrolling through search results that yielded nothing useful. Frank thought about the basement room, about the elaborate radio equipment, and the careful way Morrison had documented his flights. Maybe disappearing was the whole point. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Frank was opening the garage when a black sedan pulled up to the curb. and two men in dark suits got out. They looked like federal agents from a television show, complete with sunglasses and the kind of serious expressions that suggested they weren't here to discuss automotive repair. "Mr. Delaney?" The taller of the two men approached with careful, measured steps. "I'm Agent Martinez, FBI. This is Agent Thompson. We'd like to talk to you about your recent property acquisition." Frank felt his stomach drop. "The airport?" "Among other things. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Frank led them into the garage office, his mind racing through possibilities. Had he stumbled onto some kind of crime scene? Was the airport purchase somehow illegal? Were Morrison and Kowalski fugitives rather than heroes? Agent Martinez settled into the chair across from Frank's desk with the practiced ease of someone who conducted a lot of interviews. "Mr. Delaney, we understand you've been exploring the basement level of the hangar facility." Frank tried to keep his expression neutral. "How do you know that?" "The property has been under periodic surveillance for several decades. When you triggered the motion sensors in the basement, our system flagged it for investigation." Martinez leaned forward slightly. "We need to know exactly what you found down there." The truth seemed like the safest option. Frank told them about the radio equipment, about Morrison's logbook, about the mysterious references to cargo and special deliveries. He showed them the photographs on his phone and described his theory that the airport had been involved in Cold War intelligence operations. When he finished, the two agents exchanged a look that suggested Frank had confirmed something they already suspected. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez said carefully, "how much do you know about your late wife's family history?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Sarah's family history was a subject they'd rarely discussed during their marriage, mainly because there wasn't much to discuss. Her parents had died when she was young, and she'd been raised by an aunt who had passed away shortly after Frank and Sarah's wedding. Sarah had always been matter-of-fact about her orphan status, treating it as simply one of those unfortunate circumstances that some people had to navigate. "Sarah's parents died when she was 7, Frank said slowly. "Car accident. She was raised by her Aunt Martha in Cleveland." Agent Martinez nodded, but his expression suggested this wasn't news to him. "What did Sarah tell you about her father's work?" "He was a janitor at some government building." "Why are you asking about Sarah? She's been dead for 2 years." Agent Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than his partner's. "Mr. Delaney, your wife's father wasn't a janitor. His name was Thomas Kowalski, and he was one of the most effective intelligence handlers the CIA ever employed." Frank felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. The bronze star he'd found in the airport desk belonged to Sarah's father. The man he'd been researching, the mysterious TK from Morrison's logbook, was his late wife's father, a man Sarah had believed was a janitor who died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. "That's impossible," Frank said, but even as he spoke, he was remembering details that suddenly took on new significance. Sarah's unusual facility with languages, her uncanny ability to read people's motivations, the way she sometimes seemed to know things about current events before they appeared in the news. Thomas Kowalski faked his death in 1962 to protect his family from Soviet retaliation, Martinez continued. His work involved managing a network of defectors and assets during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. The airport was one of several safe houses he used for debriefing and relocating high-value defectors. Frank's head was spinning. If he faked his death, then where did he go? What happened to him? He took on a new identity and moved to Millbrook, where he could keep an eye on the airport and its contents while maintaining his cover. He married a local woman named Helen Chen in 1965. The name hit Frank like a thunderbolt. Helen Chen, Mrs. Chen, his neighbor, the woman who had been feeding him and Danny, who had known Sarah's father, who had acted like she understood grief in a way that went deeper than simple sympathy. "Mrs. Chen," Frank whispered. "Thomas Kowalski became Thomas Chen," Martinez confirmed. "He lived quietly in Millbrook for 40 years until his death in 2020. His widow is still alive. Frank sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications. Mrs. Chen wasn't just a kind neighbor, she was Sarah's stepmother. She had known the truth about Sarah's father all along, had watched Frank marry Sarah and raise Danny, all while keeping the biggest secret imaginable. Why didn't Sarah know? Frank asked. Kowalski felt it was safer for everyone if Sarah believed her parents were dead, Thompson explained. The fewer people who knew his real identity, the better. He maintained surveillance on Sarah throughout her life, but from a distance. When she moved to Millbrook to work at the hospital, it wasn't coincidence he arranged for her to get the job so he could be closer to her. Frank thought about all the times Mrs. Chen had seemed to know exactly what Sarah needed, how she'd appeared with meals and advice and comfort at precisely the right moments. She hadn't been a kind stranger, she'd been protecting her stepdaughter, honoring a promise to a man who'd sacrificed everything to keep his family safe. "What's in the airport basement?" Frank asked. What was so important that Kowalski spent 40 years guarding it? Martinez and Thompson exchanged another look, and Frank got the sense that he'd reached the limit of what they were willing to share. "That's classified, Mr. Delaney. What I can tell you is that certain assets were placed in secure storage during the Cold War, and those assets were never officially recovered or redistributed. As far as the government is concerned, they don't exist. But they do exist. Hypothetically, yes. And hypothetically, if someone were to discover these assets, they would belong to whoever found them, provided they hadn't been obtained through illegal means." Frank stared at the agents. "You're telling me that whatever is hidden at that airport is legally mine?" "We're telling you that the government has no official interest in property that officially doesn't exist," Martinez said carefully. "However, there are other parties who might be very interested in recovering assets they believe belong to them." Before Frank could ask what other parties, Agent Thompson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "We need to go," he said to Martinez. "Mr. Delaney, a word of advice. Be very careful who you trust. Thomas Kowalski had enemies, and some of them have long memories." After the agents left, Frank sat alone in his garage office, trying to make sense of everything he'd learned. Sarah's father was a liver, had been alive for most of Sarah's adult life. Mrs. Chen was Sarah's stepmother. The airport contained assets that might be worth a fortune, but which also came with dangers he didn't understand. That afternoon, Frank closed the garage early and drove to Mrs. Chen's house. She was in her garden, tending to tomato plants with the careful attention of someone who understood that growing things required patience and dedication. When she saw Frank approaching, her expression shifted from mild surprise to resignation, as if she'd been expecting this conversation for years. "You know," she said simply, "the FBI visited me this morning. They told me about Thomas Kowalski, about Thomas Chen." Frank sat down on her porch steps. "They told me Sarah was your stepdaughter." Mrs. Chen set down her gardening tools and joined him on the steps. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had shared grief without knowing they had also shared family. "I wanted to tell you," she said finally. "So many times, especially after Sarah got sick, but Thomas made me promise. He said the secret was the only thing that kept everyone safe." "Safe from what?" "From people who still think they're fighting the Cold War. Thomas helped a lot of people defect, people who brought information that damaged Soviet intelligence operations. Some of those operations had American participants, businessmen, politicians, academics, who sold secrets for money or ideology. When the Soviet Union collapsed, those people thought they were safe. But Thomas kept records." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "The assets at the airport, they're not just money, are they?" Thomas called it his insurance policy. Files, photographs, recordings, evidence that could destroy reputations and careers even today. He said if anything happened to him, if his enemies ever found him, he wanted someone trustworthy to decide what to do with the information. "And he chose me?" Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. "He chose Sarah, but Sarah is gone, so now it's up to you and Danny." She reached over and patted Frank's hand. "Thomas would have liked you. He always said the best people were the ones who fixed things instead of breaking them. As Frank drove home, his mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. The airport wasn't just an abandoned piece of property, it was a time capsule from the Cold War, containing secrets that powerful people might kill to protect. He'd bought himself a mystery that could make him rich or get him killed, possibly both. When he arrived home, Danny was waiting with a concerned expression and a manila envelope. "Dad, we need to talk. I got a call from someone claiming to represent investors who want to buy the airport. They're offering $2 million, cash, for immediate sale." Frank took the envelope and examined the letterhead. Meridian Development Corporation, with an address in Columbus and a phone number that probably led to a switchboard designed to deflect questions. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd pass along the message. But Dad, these people knew things about me scholarship, your mortgage situation, even Mom's maiden name. How would developers know that kind of personal information?" Frank looked at his son and realized that their quiet life in Millbrook was over. Whether he wanted it or not, Frank had become the guardian of secrets that other people would do anything to possess. The only question now was whether he was strong enough to protect them, and whether Sarah's father had left him the tools he needed to survive what was coming. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with Mrs. Chen and Danny, sorting through a shoebox full of documents that she'd kept hidden in her attic for over 20 years. The papers told a story that was both more complicated and more dangerous than Frank had imagined. Thomas Kowalski hadn't just been an intelligence handler, he'd been the architect of one of the most successful defector programs in CIA history. Between 1951 and 1962, he'd managed the safe passage of 43 Soviet assets, including scientists, military officers, and KGB operatives who brought with them secrets that shaped American policy throughout the Cold War. But the most valuable asset he'd handled wasn't a personet, was a collection of documents known internally as the Moscow Files. These files contained detailed records of American citizens who had collaborated with Soviet intelligence, including their real names, their handlers, their methods of communication, and the specific information they had provided to the enemy. Thomas said the files were like a nuclear weapon. Mrs. Chen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too dangerous to use, but too important to destroy. He spent 40 years keeping them safe, waiting for the right moment to decide their fate." Danny studied a photograph of a younger Thomas Kowalski in military uniform, standing beside Captain Morrison in front of a small aircraft. Why didn't he turn them over to the FBI or the CIA when the Soviet Union collapsed? Because some of the names in those files belonged to people who were still alive, still in positions of power. Mrs. Chen replied, "Congressmen, judges, business leaders who had sold secrets in their youth and gone on to build respectable lives. Thomas said exposing them would cause more harm than good." Frank examined a map that showed the airport's underground layout in precise detail. The basement level he'd discovered was just the beginning. There were additional storage areas, emergency escape routes, and what appeared to be a vault buried even deeper beneath the hangar foundation. "The encryption key," Frank said suddenly, remembering the brass cipher wheel he'd found in Morrison's compass. "It's for decoding the files, isn't it?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "Thomas taught me how to use it, in case something happened to him. The files are written in a code that changes with each document, but the key provides the pattern for decryption." They worked until midnight, using the cipher wheel to decode several pages from the Moscow files. The names that emerged were shocking in their familiarity. A former senator who now ran a major foundation, a Supreme Court justice who had died the previous year, a pharmaceutical executive whose company had government contracts worth billions. But it was the last name on the list that made Frank's blood run cold. Rodriguez, Victor, current identity. Miguel Rodriguez, banking executive, Millbrook, Ohio. "Rodriguez isn't just the bank manager," Frank said slowly. "He's one of them. He's been watching me, watching all of us, for years." Mrs. Chen went pale. "Thomas suspected. but he could never prove it. He said Rodriguez showed up in Millbrook too conveniently, too perfectly positioned to monitor the town's financial activities. Danny looked up from the documents he'd been studying. "Dad, if Rodriguez is working for the Russians, then those developers who want to buy the airport aren't developers at all," Frank finished. "They're agents sent to recover the files." The realization hit them like a cold wave. Frank hadn't just stumbled into a real estate opportunity, he'd walked into the middle of an espionage operation that had been dormant for decades. By purchasing the airport, he'd inadvertently triggered a sequence of events that had brought old enemies out of hiding. Mrs. Chen stood up abruptly and walked to her kitchen window, peering through the curtains at the street outside. "There's a car parked across from your house, Frank. Same car that's been there for the past 3 nights. Frank joined her at the window. A dark sedan sat under the streetlight, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. As they watched, another car pulled up behind it, and Frank recognized Rodriguez's silver BMW. "We need to get those files," Frank said. "Tonight, before they decide to take more direct action." "It's too dangerous," Mrs. Chen protested. "Thomas spent years learning how to move undetected around that airport. You'll be walking into a trap." But Frank was already planning. His years as a mechanic had taught him to think systematically about complex problems, to break them down into manageable components. The airport's layout, the underground passages, the security measures that Thomas had installed, they were all mechanical systems that could be understood and navigated with the right approach. "Danny, I need you to stay here with Mrs. Chen," Frank said. "If something goes wrong, call Agent Martinez. His card is on my desk." "I'm coming with you," Danny replied firmly. "This is my family's legacy too. Mom would want me to help protect it." Frank looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the teenager he'd been protecting, but the young man he'd become. Danny had inherited Sarah's intelligence and Frank's determination, and maybe it was time to trust him with the family secrets they were only now beginning to understand. "All right," Frank said, "but we do this my way, carefully, quietly, and with a plan for getting out if things go wrong." Mrs. Chen produced a set of keys from her jewelry box, each one labeled with cryptic markings that Frank now recognized as Thomas's coding system. "These will get you into the deeper levels. Thomas made me memorize the security protocols, just in case." As they prepared to leave, Frank felt a strange sense of completion, as if all the seemingly random events of the past month had been leading to this moment. Sarah's dreams, the impulse to buy the airport, the discovery of Morrison's logbook, they weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle that Sarah's father had constructed years ago, a puzzle that could only be solved by someone who loved Sarah enough to risk everything for the truth. Frank slipped Thomas's bronze star into his pocket, next to the cipher wheel and the keys to secrets that had been buried for decades. Whatever they found in the depths of the airport, whatever dangers they faced from Rodriguez and his associates, Frank knew he was finally doing what Sarah had been trying to tell him to do in those dreams. He was uncovering the truth about the people he loved, and he was protecting the legacy that Thomas Kowalski had died to preserve. As they drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook toward the airport, Frank glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the dark sedan following at a discreet distance. The game was no longer about real estate or development opportunities. It was about survival, and Frank was about to discover whether a small-town mechanic could outwit professional spies who had been playing this game for decades. But he had advantages they didn't expect. The knowledge of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, the love of a son who was ready to fight for his family's honor, and the guidance of a wife whose dreams had led him exactly where he needed to be. The airport waited in the darkness ahead, holding secrets that could change everything or destroy them all. Frank and Danny approached the airport from the east side, using a service road that Thomas's maps indicated would be less visible from the main highway. Frank had disabled his truck's interior lights and instructed Danny to keep his phone on silent, but even these precautions felt inadequate against adversaries who had been trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the abandoned runway stretched out before them like a concrete lake under the starlight. Frank used Thomas's keys to unlock a maintenance shed that he'd never noticed during his daytime visits, revealing an entrance to the underground tunnel system that connected various points around the airport property. "This is incredible," Danny whispered as they descended into the tunnel. "Grandpa Thomas built his own underground railroad." The tunnel was narrow but well constructed, with electric lighting that still functioned after decades of disuse. Frank followed the route indicated on Thomas's hand-drawn map, counting steps and looking for landmarks until they reached a heavy steel door marked only with the number 7. Beyond the door lay the real heart of Thomas Kowalski's operation. The room was larger than Frank had expected, filled with filing cabinets, communication equipment, and a vault that looked like it belonged in a bank rather than an abandoned airport. But it was the wall of photographs that captured Frank's attention, surveillance photos of people entering and leaving various locations, many of them bearing dates from the 1980s and 1990s. He never stopped working, Frank realized. Even after he officially died, he kept gathering intelligence. Danny was examining a sophisticated radio setup that appeared to be capable of monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. "Dad, look at this. Some of these recordings are labeled with dates from last year. Someone was still using this equipment recently." Frank felt a chill of understanding. Thomas hadn't just hidden the Moscow files and disappeared. He'd continued his intelligence work until his death, updating his records and gathering new evidence of ongoing espionage activities. Rodriguez and his associates weren't just trying to recover old secrets. They were trying to eliminate evidence of current operations. The vault required 2 keys, both of which Mrs. Chen had provided, along with a numeric code that she'd made Frank memorize. Inside, Frank found exactly what Agent Martinez had hinted at: bearer bonds worth approximately $200 million, gold bars that probably dated from the Soviet era, and most importantly, 3 metal filing boxes containing the complete Moscow files. But as Frank lifted the first box from the vault, he heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel outside. "Danny, get behind the radio equipment," Frank whispered urgently. "Stay hidden, no matter what happens." The steel door opened with a mechanical hiss, and Rodriguez entered the room, followed by 2 men Frank didn't recognize. In the harsh, fluorescent light, Rodriguez looked differentada, more dangerous, like a mask had been removed to reveal the predator underneath. "Good evening, Frank," Rodriguez said, his accent noticeably thicker than it had been in all their previous conversations. "I see you found Thomas's little treasure room." Frank straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Victor Rodriguez, I presume. Or do you prefer your real name?" Rodriguez smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Very good. Thomas trained you well, even from beyond the grave." "Yes, I am Victor Rodriguez, formerly of the GRU. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to lead me to this room." One of Rodriguez's companions, a thin man with pale eyes, stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "Where are the files, old man? We know they are here." Frank glanced at the filing boxes, trying to calculate distances and angles. He was outnumbered 3-1, and his opponents were almost certainly armed. But he had one advantage they didn't know about. Danny was hidden behind the radio equipment, and Frank could see him slowly reaching for something that looked like an emergency alarm. "The files are in the vault," Frank said, buying time. "But I'm curious about something. How did you know I'd found this place?" Rodriguez pulled out a small device that Frank recognized as a motion detector. Thomas was thorough, but not perfect. He installed sensors to alert him when someone entered his sacred chamber, but he never considered that those same sensors could be monitored by someone else. "I've been tracking every movement in this facility since you bought the property." "Then why didn't you just take the files yourself?" "Because the vault requires keys and codes that Thomas never shared with anyone except his wife. We needed you to do the hard work of convincing her to cooperate." Rodriguez gestured toward the filing boxes. "Now please, step away from the vault so my associates can collect what belongs to us." Frank didn't move. These files don't belong to you. They belong to the American people, to history, to the families of the people whose names are in there. The pale-eyed man pulled out a pistol with practiced efficiency. "Step away, or we will kill you and take the files anyway." It was then that Danny triggered the alarm. The sound was deafening in the enclosed spacer klaxon that Thomas had probably installed to summon help in exactly this kind of situation. But more importantly, the alarm activated other systems throughout the underground complex. Emergency lights began flashing, steel doors slammed shut to isolate different sections, and somewhere in the distance, Frank could hear the sound of radio equipment broadcasting automated distress signals. In the confusion, Frank dove toward the vault and grabbed two of the filing boxes, while Danny emerged from his hiding place with what appeared to be a very old but functional flare gun. "Nobody move!" Danny shouted, his voice cracking slightly but his aim steady. Rodriguez laughed. A child with a flare gun. How touching. But the pale-eyed man was looking around the room with growing alarm. "Victor, we need to leave. Now. Those radio signals, they're broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Police, FBI, maybe military will respond." Frank clutched the filing boxes to his chest and backed toward what he hoped was an emergency exit. "You can't hide from this forever, Rodriguez." Thomas documented everything. Every payment, every dead drop, every piece of intelligence you sold. "Even if you kill us, the truth is going to come out." "The truth," Rodriguez snarled, "is that idealistic fools like Thomas Kowalski never understood that the Cold War never ended. It just became more subtle, more profitable. The information in those files is worth more than money its leverage over some of the most powerful people in America." Frank found the emergency exit handle and pulled it, revealing a narrow staircase that led upward. "Danny, go!" What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. Danny fired the flare gun, filling the room with acrid smoke and brilliant red light. Frank pushed his son toward the stairs and followed, still carrying the filing boxes. Behind them, he could hear Rodriguez screaming orders in what sounded like Russian. They emerged from the underground complex through a concealed exit near the control tower, gasping in the cool night air. In the distance, Frank could see headlights approaching fast along the airport's access road, multiple vehicles, some of them with the distinctive light bars of police cars. "The radio signals," Danny panted. "They worked. Help is coming." Frank looked at the filing boxes in his arms, then at his son, who had just proven himself to be far braver and more resourceful than Frank had ever imagined. Whatever happened next, they had succeeded in preventing Rodriguez from recovering the Moscow files. Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission to protect those secrets was complete. But as they waited for the cavalry to arrive, Frank realized that their victory had come at a cost. Rodriguez and his associates now knew exactly who they were and what they had found. The quiet life Frank had tried to build in Millbrook was over forever. From now on, they would be targets, guardians of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. Frank had wanted to honor Sarah's memory and uncover his family's hidden history. Instead, he had inherited a war that his father-in-law had fought in shadows for decades. The first police car pulled up to the gate, followed by FBI vehicles and what looked like a military transport. Agent Martinez emerged from one of the cars, speaking rapidly into a radio as he surveyed the scene. Frank stood up slowly, still holding the filing boxes, and prepared to explain how a small-town mechanic had accidentally stumbled into the biggest intelligence operation in Cold War history. Whatever came next, he and Danny would face it together, armed with the truth and the knowledge that some secrets are worth dying to protect. The FBI command center that materialized at Millbrook Airport over the next 12 hours was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Agent Martinez had called in resources from Columbus, Cincinnati, and Washington, D.C., transforming the abandoned hangar into a high-tech operations center complete with satellite communications, computer terminals, and enough armed agents to secure a small city. Frank sat in what had once been Morrison's office, now serving as an interrogation room, while federal investigators catalogued every document in the Moscow files. Danny waited in an adjacent room under protective custody, occasionally visible through the window, as agents took his statement and explained the witness protection protocols they wanted him to consider. "The files are even more comprehensive than we expected," Agent Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Frank with a stack of folders that represented 40 years of Thomas Kowalski's intelligence work. "Your father-in-law documented not just the original Soviet assets, but their children, their associates, their business relationships. It's a complete map of a sleeper network that's been operating in plain sight for decades." Frank studied the photographs that Martinez spread across the desk. Rodriguez's real identity was confirmed: Victor Kozlov, former GRU officer who had entered the United States in 1985 under deep cover as a business student. Over the past 35 years, he'd built a banking career that gave him access to the financial records of thousands of Americans, including government employees, military contractors, and political figures. "How many others are there?" Frank asked. "Based on these files, we estimate at least 200 active assets in positions of influence throughout the Midwest. Businessmen, academics, local politicians, law enforcement officers." Thomas identified them all, tracked their careers, documented their communications with handlers. Martinez pulled out a photograph that made Frank's stomach clench. It showed Rodriguez meeting with a man Frank recognized as County Commissioner Bradley, the same official who had questioned Frank's mental state after the airport purchase. "Bradley's been feeding Rodriguez information about local government activities for 15 years, Martinez explained. "Property acquisitions, zoning changes, economic development plans. It's a perfect intelligence operation, low profile, high-value information that helps foreign investors make strategic decisions." Frank thought about all the businesses that had closed in Millbrook, all the development projects that had failed, all the economic opportunities that had somehow never materialized. They weren't just gathering intelligence, they were sabotaging the town. "Economic warfare," Martinez confirmed. "Keep American communities weak and dependent, make them vulnerable to foreign investment and influence. It's more effective than military conquest, because the victims never realize they're under attack." A younger agent approached the table with a laptop computer. "Sir, we've intercepted communications from the Kozlov network. They're planning something for tonight." Martinez studied the screen, his expression growing increasingly grim. "They're calling it a final retrieval operation. Looks like they're not planning to retreat quietly." Frank felt ice form in his stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means they're going to try to eliminate everyone who knows about the files. You, Danny, Mrs. Chen, probably several federal agents. They'll make it look like an accident gas explosion, electrical fire, something that would destroy all the evidence." The young agent handed Martinez another report. "Local assets are being activated. We've identified at least 12 individuals in Millbrook who've received coded instructions in the past 6 hours. They're moving into position around key locations." Frank stood up abruptly. "Mrs. Chen, is she safe?" "We have agents with her, but Kozlov's people know the town better than we do. They've had decades to plan for this contingency." Martinez closed the laptop and looked directly at Frank. "I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. Are you prepared to see this through to the end, no matter what it costs?" Frank thought about Sarah's dreams, about the vintage pilot who had pointed him toward this airport, about Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission to protect American secrets from foreign adversaries. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd discovered, had led to this moment where he had to choose between safety and justice. "What do you need me to do?" Martinez smiled grimly. Thomas left more than just files in that vault. He left weapons, communication equipment, and detailed plans for defending this facility against exactly the kind of attack Kozlov is planning. But the defense systems require someone who understands the airport's layout and mechanical systems, someone who can improvise repairs under pressure. Frank looked around the hangar that had become the center of an intelligence war that most Americans didn't even know was being fought. Morrison's service pistol lay on the desk beside Thomas's bronze star, artifacts from a conflict that had started before Frank was born and was now his responsibility to finish. "Show me what you need," Frank said. The next 6 hours were the most intensive of Frank's life. Under Martinez's direction, he activated defensive systems that Thomas had built into the airport's infrastructure over decades of careful preparation. Motion sensors, automated locks, communication jammers, and even booby traps designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Danny insisted on helping despite the obvious danger, and Frank had to admit that his son's technical skills were superior to his own when it came to the computerized systems Thomas had installed. Together, they turned Millbrook Airport into a fortress that could hold off a small army, at least temporarily. "Your father-in-law was a paranoid genius," Martinez observed as they tested the perimeter alarms. "He built this place to withstand a siege." Mrs. Chen arrived under heavy escort as the sun began to set, carrying additional boxes of documents and equipment that Thomas had stored at their house. Despite her age, she moved with the crisp efficiency of someone who had trained for this moment for decades. "Thomas always said this day would come," she told Frank as they worked side by side to program the defense systems. "He said the network would eventually become desperate enough to risk everything for these files." Frank paused in his work to study the elderly woman who had been feeding him and Danny, caring for them, protecting them without ever revealing that she was family. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because Thomas made me promise to let you choose your own path. He said forcing people to carry secrets they didn't want was just another form of tyranny." Mrs. Chen's eyes softened. "But I think he always hoped you would find your way here eventually. Sarah used to talk about you in ways that reminded Thomas of himself when he was young, someone who fixed things instead of breaking them." As darkness fell over Millbrook, Martinez received word that Kozlov's assets were moving into final positions. The attack would come soon, probably after midnight, when most of the town was asleep, and emergency response times would be longest. "Last chance to reconsider," Martinez told Frank. "We can evacuate you and Danny to a safe location. Let federal agents handle the final confrontation." Frank looked at the control tower where Morrison's radio still broadcast on frequencies that connected him to intelligence networks around the world. He thought about Sarah's dreams, about the message she'd been trying to send him, about legacy and responsibility and the price of protecting the people you love. "This is where I belong," Frank said. "This is what Sarah was trying to tell me." Danny joined them at the window overlooking the runway where the final battle would be fought. "Dad, I've been thinking about what Mom would say if she were here. I think she'd tell us to fight for the truth, no matter how scared we are." Frank put his arm around his son's shoulders and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with academic achievements or mechanical aptitude. Danny had grown into the kind of man who would stand up for his principles, even when it meant risking everything. "Then that's what we'll do," Frank said. "We'll fight for the truth." Outside, the first shadows began moving across the airport perimeter, and Frank knew that Thomas Kowalski's war was about to become his own. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Moscow files, but the future of a town that had been under siege for decades without knowing it. Frank checked Morrison's service pistol one more time, said a prayer for Sarah's protection, and prepared to defend the legacy that 3 generations of his family had died to preserve. The final battle for Millbrook Airport was about to begin. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. with the systematic cutting of power lines leading to the airport. Frank watched from the control tower as sections of Millbrook went dark in a carefully orchestrated sequence, isolating the airport from outside communications and emergency services. But Thomas Kowalski had anticipated this move decades ago. Backup generators hummed to life automatically, and the airport's defense systems remained fully operational. 12 vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Agent Martinez reported through the radio headset Frank wore. Professional coordination, military-style tactics. Kozlov brought everyone he had. Frank adjusted the focus on Morrison's old binoculars and studied the assault team spreading across the airport perimeter. These weren't the thugs he'd expected. They moved with the disciplined precision of special forces operatives, using cover and concealment techniques that suggested extensive military training. "Danny, how are those communication systems working?" Frank called to his son, who was manning Thomas's radio equipment from the hangar below. "Broadcasting on all emergency frequencies," Danny replied. "But they're jamming most signals. I'm not sure how much is getting through." In the distance, Frank could see muzzle flashes as the FBI agents engaged Kozlov's assault teams. The federal agents were skilled and well-equipped, but they were outnumbered and fighting on unfamiliar terrain against opponents who had spent years studying the area. Frank activated the first line of Thomas's defensive, measures motion-triggered floodlights that turned night into day across the runway area. The sudden illumination caught several attackers in the open, forcing them to dive for cover behind maintenance vehicles and concrete barriers. "Beautiful," Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "That just bought us some breathing room." But Kozlov's forces adapted quickly. Frank watched through the binoculars as they began using smoke grenades to obscure their movements, advancing under cover of the artificial fog they'd created. Professional soldiers, definitely not the local assets Frank had expected. The control tower radio erupted with coded transmissions as Thomas's automatic systems began broadcasting distress signals on military and intelligence frequencies. Somewhere in the static, Frank heard what sounded like helicopter rotors in the distance reinforcements, he hoped, though he couldn't tell if they were friendly or hostile. An explosion rocked the hangar below, and Frank felt the control tower sway slightly. Kozlov's people had breached the perimeter and were now fighting their way through the building where the Moscow files were stored. "Dad," Danny's voice carried up the stairwell. "They're in the building. Martinez says we need to fall back to the secondary position." Frank grabbed Morrison's pistol and the bronze medal that had started this whole adventure, then descended the narrow stairs toward the hangar level. The sound of gunfire was much louder now, punctuated by shouted orders in accented English and what Frank assumed was Russian. He found Danny and Mrs. Chen in the underground operations center, along with Agent Martinez and 3 other federal agents. The walls were lined with monitors, showing camera feeds from throughout the airport complex, and Frank could see armed figures moving systematically through areas he'd spent weeks clearing and restoring. "They're not just here for the files," Martinez said grimly. "They're planting explosives. This is a scorched earth operation. They plan to destroy everything." Mrs. Chen sat at Thomas's communication console, her fingers moving across switches and dials with practiced efficiency. Despite her age, she looked completely calm, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. "Thomas always said the real battle wouldn't be about the files themselves," she said without looking up from her work. "It would be about whether America would fight to protect its secrets or let foreign enemies walk away with them." Frank studied the monitor feeds and began to understand the tactical situation. Kozlov's forces had superior numbers and training, but they were operating in an environment that Thomas had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Every corridor, every room, every exit had been designed to channel attackers into predetermined positions where they could be isolated and defeated. "The memorial plaque," Frank said suddenly, remembering something from Thomas's notes. He said the real treasure wasn't in the vault, it was in the memorial plaque. Mrs. Chen smiled and activated another series of switches. "Thomas was always dramatic, but you're right, the most important information isn't in those files. It's in the automated systems he built to ensure the truth would survive, even if we didn't." Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder, and Frank could see new lights approaching across the Ohio countryside. Military vehicles, definitely American, with enough firepower to end this siege quickly and permanently. But Kozlov's forces had one more surprise. Through the monitors, Frank watched as a figure he recognized as the pale-eyed man from the underground confrontation approached the hangar carrying what looked like a military-grade explosive device. "Shape charge," Martinez identified, "big enough to collapse this entire building and everyone in it." Frank looked at his son, at Mrs. Chen, at the federal agents who had risked their lives to protect Thomas's legacy. The final moment of the battle was approaching, and Frank realized that everything now depended on whether a small-town mechanic could outthink professional killers who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this situation. Morrison's pistol felt heavy in his hand as Frank prepared to make the choice that would determine whether Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission would end in victory or defeat. Frank made his decision in the space between heartbeats. While Martinez and his agents prepared for a final defensive stand, Frank slipped away through Thomas's escape tunnel, carrying Morrison's pistol and a plan that was equal parts desperation and mechanical intuition. He emerged from the tunnel system near the maintenance shed where this entire adventure had begun, close enough to see the pale-eyed man positioning his explosive device against the hangar's main support beam. The mathematical precision of the placement told Frank everything he needed to know. This wasn't just demolition, it was engineering designed to ensure that nothing inside the building would survive. But Thomas Kowalski had been an engineer too, and Frank was beginning to understand the layers of protection the old spy had built into his fortress. The shaped charge would indeed collapse the hangar, but the underground operations center was designed to survive even that level of destruction. Thomas had planned for everything, including his own death. Frank moved through the shadows with the careful steps his father had taught him during hunting trips decades ago. The pale-eyed man was focused on his technical work, adjusting timers and checking connections with the concentration of someone who took professional pride in destruction. 30 seconds to detonation, the man spoke into his radio, his accent thick with tension. Frank emerged from cover with Morrison's pistol raised. Step away from the device. The pale-eyed man turned slowly, his hand still holding the detonator. In the dim light from the hangar, Frank could see that he was younger than expected, maybe 40, with the lean build of someone who had spent years in military training. "You are the mechanic," the man said, as if Frank were an interesting specimen. "Kozlov said you would run when the shooting started." "Kozlov was wrong about a lot of things," Frank replied, keeping the pistol steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You will not shoot me. You are not a killer." Frank thought about Sarah's death, about the years of grief and guilt that had led him to this moment, about Danny's future, about Mrs. Chen's loyalty, about Thomas Kowalski's 40-year sacrifice to protect American secrets. "You're right," Frank said. "I'm not a killer, but I'm a mechanic, and I understand how things work." Before the pale-eyed man could react, Frank shot out the device's control panel, sending sparks flying as electronic components shattered. The shaped charge was still dangerous, but without its sophisticated timing mechanism, it was just an expensive piece of metal. The pale-eyed man lunged toward Frank with practiced speed, but mechanical work had given Frank strong hands and quick reflexes. They struggled for control of the pistol, while around them, the battle for Millbrook Airport reached its crescendo. The sound of military helicopters was deafening now, and through the hangar windows, Frank could see searchlights sweeping across the runway as American forces finally arrived in overwhelming numbers. Kozlov's assault team was trapped between the FBI agents inside the building and the military units outside. Frank managed to break free from his opponent's grip and back toward the hangar entrance, keeping the pistol trained on the pale-eyed man who was now reaching for his own weapon. "It's over," Frank called out. "Your whole network is blown. Kozlov's finished." "Networks can be rebuilt," the man replied, drawing his pistol with fluid motion. "But some secrets must die with the people who know them." The final confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of someone Frank hadn't expected to see alive, Victor Rodriguez, or Kozlov, limping through the hangar entrance with blood on his shirt and desperation in his eyes. "Dmitri, we leave now," Kozlov ordered his subordinate. "The mission is compromised." But Dmitri shook his head, his pale eyes fixed on Frank with the intensity of someone who had crossed too many lines to retreat now. "The mechanic knows everything. He must be eliminated. There's no time." Dmitri's shot went wide as Frank dove behind Morrison's old workbench, the bullet sparking off concrete and steel. Frank rolled to his left and came up firing, his shots forcing both Russians to take cover behind the damaged aircraft parts that littered the hangar floor. Outside, the military helicopters were landing, disgorging soldiers who would secure the perimeter within minutes. But minutes felt like hours when Frank was trapped in a firefight with professional killers who had nothing left to lose. "Frank!" Danny's voice echoed from the underground entrance. "Dad, are you up there?" "Stay down!" Frank shouted back, not wanting his son to become a target in the crossfire. Kozlov was speaking rapidly in Russian, probably coordinating with whatever remained of his assault team. Frank couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. These were the final orders of a commander whose operation had collapsed around him. A new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching fast and low. Through the hangar's broken windows, Frank saw military aircraft circling the airport like mechanical vultures, their searchlights turning night into harsh, artificial day. "This is Colonel Hayes, United States Air Force." An amplified voice boomed across the airfield. "You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." Dmitri laughed, a sound devoid of humor. American efficiency, always too late, always too loud. He emerged from cover with his pistol raised, not toward Frank, but toward the underground entrance where Danny and the others were hidden. Frank didn't think, he simply moved, throwing himself between Dmitri's gun and the stairwell that led to his son. The bullet caught Frank in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending Morrison's pistol clattering across the concrete floor. Pain exploded through his arm and chest, but Frank stayed on his feet, driven by determination and adrenaline. Kozlov grabbed Dmitri's arm. "Enough. We go now, or we die here." But as they turned toward what Frank assumed was another escape route, Agent Martinez appeared in the hangar doorway with a tactical team behind him. The FBI agents moved with practiced precision, their weapons trained on the two Russians who suddenly found themselves with nowhere to run. "Viktor Kozlov, Dmitry Volkov, you are under arrest for espionage, murder, and conspiracy against the United States," Martinez announced with satisfaction that was audible even over the sound of helicopters and shouting soldiers. Frank slumped against the workbench, clutching his wounded shoulder, and watched as the two men who had terrorized his town for decades were finally brought to justice. Danny emerged from the underground complex and rushed to his father's side, followed by Mrs. Chen and several medics who had arrived with the military forces. "Dad, you're hurt," Danny said, his voice tight with concern. "I'm okay," Frank managed, though the pain in his shoulder suggested otherwise. "Is everyone else safe?" "Everyone's safe," Mrs. Chen confirmed, her voice carrying decades of relief. "Thomas's mission is finally complete." As military medics worked on Frank's shoulder, he watched Kozlov and Dmitri being led away in handcuffs. The banker who had seemed so respectable, so much a part of Millbrook's community, was revealed as what he'd always been, a foreign operative who had spent 35 years working to weaken and exploit the town Frank called home. Through the hangar windows, Frank could see the sun beginning to rise over Millbrook Airport, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of Sarah's favorite sunrise. The battle was over, the secrets were safe, and for the first time in 2 years, Frank felt like Sarah would be proud of the choices he'd made. Colonel Hayes approached with a folder thick with official documents. "Mr. Delaney, on behalf of the United States government, I want to thank you for your service to this country. The intelligence you've helped recover will prevent attacks and save American lives for years to come." Frank accepted the folder with his good hand, then looked around the hangar that had become the center of an intelligence war most Americans would never know had been fought. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Colonel Hayes said with a smile, "you get to decide what to do with the most secure airport in Ohio." 6 months later, Frank stood beside the newly installed memorial plaque at the entrance to the Thomas Kowalski Center for Aviation History, watching as the first group of school children filed past on their way to tour the restored hangar. The bronze dedication gleamed in the morning sunlight, its words simple but profound. In memory of Thomas Kowalski, Captain James Morrison, and all who served in silence to preserve freedom. The transformation of Millbrook Airport had exceeded everyone's expectations. The $200 million in recovered assets, legally franks under federal asset forfeiture laws, had funded not just the memorial, but a complete restoration of the facility. The runways were smooth and modern, capable of handling both vintage aircraft and contemporary business jets. The control tower functioned again, staffed by retired air traffic controllers who volunteered their time to support the flying museum that had become Millbrook's primary tourist attraction. Danny emerged from the hangar wearing a pilot's uniform, having completed his first solo flight in Morrison's restored Cessna just an hour earlier. The boy who had been devastated by his father's seemingly irrational airport purchase was now planning a career in aviation. Inspired by his grandfather's heroic legacy and determined to honor the family history he'd never known existed. The tour group from Indianapolis just landed, Danny reported, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had found his calling. 32 people, including 2 World War II veterans who knew some of the pilots who flew out of here during the war. Frank nodded, still amazed by how completely their lives had changed. The garage in town was now managed by Pete Morrison's nephew, a skilled mechanic who had returned to Millbrook specifically to work on the vintage aircraft that were becoming the center of a thriving restoration business. Frank still worked on engines, but now they were Pratt, Whitneys and Wright radials instead of Chevrolets and Fords. Mrs. Chen approached from the direction of the visitor center, moving with the spry energy of someone who had finally been relieved of a burden she'd carried for decades. She now served as the museum's official historian, sharing carefully edited versions of Thomas's story with visitors who came from around the world to learn about the secret war that had been fought in small-town America. The congressman's office called, she told Frank. The bill to designate this as a National Historic Site passed committee this morning. It should reach the floor for a full vote next week. Frank smiled at the irony. The airport that had made him a laughingstock was now being recognized as one of the most significant Cold War preservation sites in the country. The underground complex that had hidden Thomas's secrets was now a museum exhibit that educated visitors about the price of freedom and the courage of people who fought battles that could never be acknowledged publicly. The memorial had attracted more than just tourists. Several of the assets identified in the Moscow files had quietly approached federal authorities to confess their involvement and provide information about ongoing foreign intelligence operations. The network that Kozlov had spent decades building was systematically dismantled, its members either arrested or turned into double agents working for American intelligence. Rodriguez himself, Frank, still thought of him by his false name, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole after pleading guilty to espionage charges. In exchange for his cooperation, several members of his network received lighter sentences, though their careers in banking, politics, and business were permanently destroyed. Frank's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that he sometimes touched when he was thinking about the night that changed everything. The wound had been a small price to pay for the knowledge that his family's secrets were finally safe, that Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission had been completed successfully. As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself in Morrison's old office, now restored to its 1950s appearance, but equipped with modern security systems that would have impressed Thomas himself. The desk where he'd found the Bronze Star was now protected behind glass, part of an exhibit that told the story of ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things to protect their country. Danny joined him there as the last tour group departed, settling into the chair that had once been Morrison's command post. "I've been thinking about Mom," Danny said quietly, "about whether she knew what Grandpa Thomas had done, whether she suspected that Mrs. Chen was family." Frank considered the question that had haunted him for months. "I think she knew something. Maybe not the details, but she always had good instincts about people. She liked Mrs. Chen immediately, trusted her in ways that seemed to go deeper than simple friendship. And the dreams. Do you think she was really trying to tell you about this place?" Frank looked out the window at the runway, where Morrison's planes had once carried secrets that shaped the Cold War, where Thomas Kowalski had built a fortress to protect American intelligence from foreign enemies. "I think she was trying to tell me to stop being afraid," Frank said finally, "to stop hiding from the parts of life that seemed too complicated or dangerous to handle. She knew I needed to find something bigger than my own grief to give my life meaning again." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "She'd be proud of what we've built here." "Yes," Frank agreed, "she would be." As the sun set behind the restored hangar, Frank walked the perimeter of the airport one more time, following the route he'd taken that first evening when the place had seemed like nothing more than cracked concrete and broken dreams. Now it was alive again, serving pilots and preserving history, and telling the story of people who had sacrificed everything to protect the freedoms that most Americans took for granted. Frank paused at Sarah's grave on his way home, the small cemetery visible from the airport's eastern boundary. Her headstone was simple granite, inscribed with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved, Wife, and Mother." But Frank had added something newer, small bronze plaque that read, "Daughter of Heroes." "We did it," Frank said quietly, placing fresh flowers beside the stone. "We found the truth you wanted us to find. We honored your father's memory. We protected the family secrets." The evening breeze carried the sound of aircraft engines from the airport, where pilots were practicing night landings under the guidance of instructors who understood that flying was both an art and a sacred trust. Frank listened to the familiar sounds and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally found his purpose. He no longer wore his wedding ring, not because he had forgotten Sarah, but because he had finally learned to carry her memory without being crushed by its weight. The love they had shared was part of him now, integrated into the man he had become, rather than a burden he had to bear. Walking home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Frank reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from grief to purpose, from isolation to community, from despair to hope. The airport had called to him, just as he'd told everyone after that first impulse purchase. But what he hadn't understood then was that the call wasn't coming from the property itself. It was coming from the people who had loved him, both living and dead, who wanted him to find his way back to the world of the living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors to educate, new aircraft to restore, new stories to preserve. Frank looked forward to all of it, knowing that he was finally doing the work he was meant to do, in the place he was meant to be, surrounded by the family he was meant to protect. The Thomas Kowalski Center for Aviation History was more than a museum. It was a testament to the idea that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were willing to fight for something larger than themselves. Frank Delaney, small-town mechanic turned guardian of secrets, had learned that lesson the hard way. But he had learned it completely, and he would never forget it again. There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching your child sleep in the backseat of your car because you can't afford rent. For Jace Tomlin, losing his wife to cancer was devastating enough, but losing their home 6 months later left him and his 10-year-old son Ollie with nowhere to turn. With $800 in his pocket, Jace made a desperate choice at a town auction. He bought a house that had been abandoned for 30 years. The neighbors called it cursed. The windows were boarded up and weeds covered the front steps. But when Jace and Ollie walked inside, they found something incredible. The house was perfectly preserved. Child's drawings hung on the walls. Toys sat waiting in corners. A diary lay open on a bedroom desk. It was like the family had just vanished one day, leaving everything behind. As father and son began cleaning their new home, they discovered the house held a secret that would change their lives forever. What had the previous family left behind that was worth more than Jace could ever imagine? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Jace Tomlin had been a different man. He'd worn pressed shirts to his job at the county planning office, came home to the smell of Sarah's cooking, and helped 10-year-old Ollie with homework at their kitchen table. Their modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street had been filled with laughter, Sarah's terrible singing from the shower, and the comfortable chaos of a family that believed tomorrow would always come. Cancer changed everything with the efficiency of a winter storm. Sarah's diagnosis arrived in March, aggressive and unforgiving. By August, she was gone, taking with her not just Jace's heart, but their financial stability. The medical bills came in, Waves insurance covered some, but not the experimental treatments, not the private nurses, not the hope they'd purchased at $30,000 a month until their savings evaporated like morning dew. The foreclosure notice arrived 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, while Jace was still finding her coffee cups in the sink and her bookmark in novels she'd never finish. He'd stared at the legal document, the words blurring through tears he thought he'd exhausted. Ollie had found him at the kitchen table at midnight, still holding the paper. "Dad." Ollie's voice had been small in the darkness. "Are we going to be okay?" Jace had pulled his son close, breathing in the scent of his hair still, using Sarah's strawberry shampoo, because neither of them could bear to change it. "We'll figure it out, buddy." "We always do." But they hadn't figured it out. The house sold at auction for less than they owed. Jace's grief had affected his work performance, and the county's budget cuts gave them an easy excuse to let him go. By November, they were living in Jace's 15-year-old Honda Civic, moving between parking lots and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. Ollie had stopped talking much after they lost the house. The boy who once chatted about everything from baseball cards to why clouds moved had grown quiet and watchful. He did his homework by streetlight, showered at the community center, and never once complained. That silence worried Jace more than any tantrum would have. The Millbrook County Courthouse held auctions every third Thursday, selling properties for back taxes. Jace had been driving past when he saw the crowd gathering. Something desperate made him pull over and walk up the courthouse steps. He'd never attended an auction, but desperation makes teachers of us all. Most of the properties went for thousands, tens of thousands. Jace was about to leave when the auctioneer called out, "Next item, 1,247 Sycamore Street. Been sitting empty for 30 years. Sold as is. No inspections, no warranties. We'll start the bidding at $500. The crowd murmured and shifted. Someone in the back called out, "That's the ghost house. Nobody wants that place." An elderly woman near Jace shook her head. "Shame what happened to that family. Poor little girl." Jace found his hand rising. 500. The auctioneer looked surprised. "I have 500. Do I hear 6? Silence stretched across the courthouse steps. The November wind rattled the oak trees, sending brown leaves skittering across the pavement. Jace could feel eyes on him, could hear whispered conversations about the fool bidding on a cursed house. 600, came a voice from the crowd. Jace's heart hammered. 600 would leave him with $200 to his name. But Ollie needed a roof, needed an address for school, needed something stable in a world that had taken everything else away. 700, Jace called out. More silence. The other bidder shook his head and walked away. 800, Jace heard himself say, though no one had bid against him. The auctioneer banged his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in the blue jacket for $800. Later, driving through Millbrook's older neighborhoods with the deed in his glove compartment, Jace wondered what he'd done. Sycamore Street sat at the town's edge, where sidewalks gave way to gravel and streetlights grew sparse. The houses here had been built in the 60s and 70s, modest homes with generous yards where children had once played and gardens had flourished. Number 1,247 stood apart from its neighbors, not just in its obvious abandonment, but in its design. Where other houses were simple ranches or split levels, this one rose 2 stories with a wraparound porch and gingerbread trim that spoke of an earlier era. Plywood covered the windows. Ivy climbed the walls with determined persistence. The front yard had surrendered to weeds and volunteer trees that created a natural barrier between the house and the street. Jace parked in the cracked driveway and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Ollie stirred in the passenger seat, rubbing his eyes. "Are we here, Dad?" "Yeah, buddy. "We're here." They approached the front porch together, stepping carefully around loose boards and trailing vines. The key from the courthouse fit perfectly in the original lock, which turned with surprising ease. The front door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the neighborhood. What they found inside defied every expectation Jace had formed during the drive over. The house wasn't destroyed. It wasn't empty. It was preserved. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the plywood, illuminating a living room that belonged to another decade. A floral sofa sat arranged with throw pillows that still held their shape. Magazines from 1993 lay fanned across a coffee table. National Geographic, Better Homes and Gardens, Scientific American. A child's sneakers sat by the door, small and white with rainbow laces, as if their owner had just stepped out of them. Jace and Ollie moved through the house with the reverence of visitors in a museum. The kitchen held dishes in the sink, a recipe box open to Emma's favorite chocolate chip cookies. The handwriting was neat, feminine, with little hearts dotting the eyes. A grocery list hung on the refrigerator, items like milk, bread, and birthday candles, written in the same careful script. Upstairs, they found 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom felt heavy with absentee, a man's watch on the nightstand, a woman's reading glasses beside a bookmark in a romance novel. The second bedroom appeared to be an office, with filing cabinets and a desk covered in papers that Jace didn't feel right examining too closely. But it was the third bedroom that made Ollie gasp and Jace's breath catch in his throat. It was a child's room, but not like any child's room Jace had ever seen. The walls were covered with drawings, not the typical stick figures and crayon houses most kids created, but detailed sketches of machines, diagrams with labels and arrows, mathematical equations written in a surprisingly mature hand. A telescope sat by the window, still pointing toward the sky. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that seemed far too advanced for a child. Advanced physics, the chemistry of life, engineering principles. On the desk sat a framed school photograph of a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. She had serious dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. A small placard at the bottom of the frame read, "Emma Hartwell, 6th grade, Millbrook Elementary." Ollie picked up the photograph with careful hands. "Dad, who is this?" Jace studied the picture, noting the intelligence in the girl's expression, the way she seemed to be looking directly at them across the decades. "I think this is who used to live here, buddy." Her name was Emma. Where did she go? It was the question that would haunt them both, the mystery that would transform their desperate search for shelter into something far more profound. Jace set the photograph back on the desk with the same care Ollie had shown. "I don't know yet, but maybe we can find out." As they explored the rest of Emma's room, Jace began to understand why the neighbors had called this place cursed, why it had sat empty for 30 years. It wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by the weight of interrupted dreams, by the sense that a remarkable life had been cut short before it could fulfill its promise. But for Jace and Ollie, standing in the golden afternoon light filtering through the covered windows, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like home had found them when they needed it most. Their first week in the house passed in a strange rhythm of discovery and domestication. Jace had managed to get the electricity turned on, though the water would take another few days. They used bottled water from the corner store and ate sandwiches by lamplight, feeling like pioneers in their own strange frontier. Ollie had claimed Emma's room as his own, but he'd been careful not to disturb anything. He slept on an air mattress on the floor while Emma's bed remained perfectly made, her stuffed animals arranged against the pillows. Each morning, Jace would find his son studying Emma's wall drawings with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. "Dad, look at this one," Ollie said on Thursday morning, pointing to a detailed sketch near the window. "It's some kind of water cleaner. See these tubes and filters? And here," he traced his finger along penciled arrows, "dirty water goes in here, and clean water comes out here." Jace studied the drawing. Even to his untrained eye, it looked sophisticated, far beyond what he'd expect from a child. Mathematical formulas filled the margins, and the mechanical details showed an understanding of engineering principles that seemed impossible for someone Emma's age. "She was really smart, wasn't she?" Ollie asked. "She was extraordinary," Jace agreed. It was while cleaning out a closet in Emma's room that Jace made the discovery that would change everything. He'd been sorting through boxes of old clothes items that might be donated or discarded when his hand brushed against something hidden behind the hanging dresses. A wooden panel in the back wall moved slightly under pressure. Curious, Jace pushed harder. The panel slid sideways, revealing a hidden compartment just large enough to hold a single notebook. His hands trembled as he lifted it out, recognizing immediately that this was something Emma had deliberately concealed. The notebook was bound, in worn leather, its pages filled with Emma's careful handwriting. The first page bore the title, "My Scientific Journal, Private Property of Emma Catherine Hartwell." Below that, in smaller print, "If you are reading this and I am not here to give you permission, please be kind to my ideas. They are all I have to leave behind." Jace's throat tightened as he read those words. He called for Ollie, who came running up the stairs with the excitement of a boy who'd been waiting all week for something interesting to happen. Together, they sat on Emma's bed and opened the journal. What they found inside defied every assumption about childhood and genius that either of them had ever held. The journal contained over 200 pages of detailed scientific observations, invention sketches, and theoretical work that read like the notebooks of a graduate student. Emma had documented experiments in chemistry, physics, and engineering with the methodical precision of a trained researcher. Her handwriting grew more confident as the journal progressed, her ideas more complex and far-reaching. One section was devoted entirely to water purification systems. Emma had apparently become fascinated with the problem after a school presentation about children in developing countries who lacked access to clean drinking water. Her initial sketches were simple, but they evolved over dozens of pages into increasingly sophisticated designs. "Look at this," Jace whispered, turning to a page titled Solar-Powered Purification Unit, version 12. The drawing showed a compact device that could apparently purify contaminated water using nothing but sunlight and a series of innovative filters. The margins were filled with calculations about flow rates, filtration efficiency, and cost projections. "She wanted to help people," Ollie said quietly. "Kids like us, but in other countries." Jace turned the page and found something that made his heart skip. It was a letter, written in Emma's careful script and dated just 3 months before the family's disappearance. "Dear future me," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you survived to be at least 16, which would make me very happy. I wanted to write down everything I've learned about the water purifier in case something happens to me before I can finish it properly. Mom says I worry too much about grown-up things, but I know I'm different from other kids, and I don't think I'm going to have as much time as everyone else." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Emma's fears about her health, her frustration with adults who didn't take her ideas seriously, and her desperate hope that someone would someday continue her work. She wrote about feeling isolated from children her own age, about teachers who didn't know what to do with a student who had already surpassed their knowledge, about parents who loved her but couldn't understand the urgency she felt about her projects. "I dream about the day when no child has to die from drinking dirty water," she wrote near the end. "I know that sounds like something an adult would say, but I've seen the photographs in National Geographic, and I can't stop thinking about it. If I can't grow up to fix this problem myself, maybe someone else will find my work and make it real." Jace had to stop reading. The weight of Emma's words, the maturity of her concerns, the poignant hope in her writing it, all felt too heavy for the small bedroom where they sat, surrounded by the artifacts of her interrupted life. "Dad." Ollie's voice was small. "What happened to her?" Before Jace could answer, they heard a knock at the front door. It was their first visitor since moving in, and Jace felt oddly protective of Emma's secrets as he went downstairs to answer it. On the porch stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that reminded Jace immediately of Emma's school photograph. She carried a covered casserole dish and wore the expression of someone who had been debating this visit for days. "I'm Martha Kowalski," she said. "I live 3 houses down. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood, and I brought you some dinner." She paused, studying Jace's face. "I also wanted to talk to you about the house you've bought." Jace invited her in, grateful for adult conversation after a week of just him and Ollie. Martha set the casserole on the kitchen counter and looked around the preserved room with an expression of deep sadness. "I haven't been inside this house in 30 years, she said quietly. "It looks exactly the same." "You knew the family?" Jace asked. Martha nodded. "I was the children's librarian at Millbrook Public Library for 42 years. Emma Hartwell was one of my most devoted patrons. That child read everything we had on science and engineering, then started requesting books through interlibrary loan that most adults couldn't understand." She smiled at the memory. She'd come in every Tuesday after school, arms loaded with returned books, ready to check out another stack that was taller than she was. "What happened to them?" The question came from Ollie, who had appeared at the bottom of the stairs with Emma's journal clutched against his chest. Martha's expression grew heavy. "Oh, honey, it was such a tragedy. Emma got very sick, very suddenly. The doctors said it was a rare condition, something with her blood. She was in and out of the hospital for months, but she kept working on her projects even when she was too weak to walk." Jace felt the pieces clicking into place. She died just 3 weeks before her 13th birthday, Martha confirmed. Her parents were devastated. They couldn't bear to change anything in the house, couldn't bear to sell it or rent it out. They just locked the door and moved away. I heard they went to live with relatives in California, but they never came back. The 3 of them stood in the preserved kitchen, surrounded by the weight of that revelation. Emma hadn't disappeared mysteriously. She had simply run out of time, the way children sometimes do when the world moves too fast for small bodies to keep up. "She was special," Martha continued, "not just smart but kind. She used to help other children with their homework at the library, always patient, even when they couldn't keep up with her thinking. She talked about wanting to invent things that would help people, especially children who were suffering somewhere in the world." Ollie held up the journal. "We found this. She wrote about wanting to help kids who don't have clean water." Martha's eyes filled with tears. She talked about that project constantly in her final months. Even when she was so weak the doctors said she should be resting, she'd be at the library researching filtration systems and solar energy. She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "I always wondered what happened to all her work." Jace looked at his son, at the elderly librarian, who had loved Emma like a granddaughter, at the kitchen where a brilliant child had sat doing homework that could have changed the world. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Would you help us understand what she was working on?" he asked Martha. "Would you help us learn about Emma?" Martha smiled through her tears. "Honey, I thought you'd never ask." Martha became their guide into Emma's world. The next afternoon, she returned with a box of photocopied articles and a determined expression that reminded Jace of his late wife when Sarah had decided something needed to be accomplished. "I spent all night going through my files," Martha explained as they settled in the living room. "I kept everything related to Emma's library research. Call it a librarian's instinct, but I knew someday this information would matter." Ollie sat cross-legged on the floor, Emma's journal open in his lap. Over the past day, he'd become increasingly absorbed in trying to decode Emma's drawings and notes. Jace watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern. It was the most animated Ollie had been since Sarah's death, but there was something almost desperate in the way he clung to Emma's story. "Tell us about the music box," Martha said, pulling out a manila folder. "Did you find it yet?" Jace and Ollie exchanged glances. "What music box?" Martha smiled. "Emma mentioned it in one of our last conversations. She said she'd hidden something important inside a music box that her grandmother had given her. She was very secretive about it, said it was the key to understanding her most important work. They spent the next hour searching Emma's room systematically. Martha directed them with the patience of someone who had helped countless children find lost library books. Finally, Ollie discovered it behind a collection of stuffed animals on a high-shelf wooden music box, carved with delicate roses and painted in soft pastels. The box was heavier than expected, its weight suggesting hidden complexity. When Jace lifted the lid, a gentle melody began to play, something classical that he didn't recognize, but that seemed to fill the room with the essence of childhood and lost innocence. "Pachelbel's Canon," Martha said softly. Emma's favorite piece. She said it was mathematically perfect. But as they listened, Ollie's head tilted with the focused attention he'd inherited from his mother. "Dad, there's something wrong with the melody." "Wrong how?" "It's not playing the right notes. Listen." Ollie hummed along, his perfect pitch-catching discrepancies that the adults missed. "Some of the notes are different from the real song. And they're not random mistakes, they're deliberate." Martha leaned forward with excitement. Emma mentioned that she'd modified something to create a code. She was fascinated by the idea of hiding messages in plain sight. Over the next 2 hours, with Martha providing historical context and Ollie's musical ear identifying the altered notes, they began to crack Emma's cipher. She had changed specific notes in the melody to correspond to letters of the alphabet. When they transcribed the modified notes onto paper, a message emerged. "Look where the morning light touches the eastern wall at 8 o'clock on the 7th day after my birthday." Jace felt a chill of recognition. According to the dates in Emma's journal, her birthday had been October 15th. 7 days later would have been October 2020, just 2 weeks before the family's disappearance. "She knew," he said quietly. "She knew she was running out of time." The next Sunday morning found all three of them in Emma's room at 8 o'clock, watching as the autumn sun streamed through the single unboarded window. The light moved across the eastern wall like a golden spotlight, illuminating different sections of Emma's drawings as the minutes passed. At exactly 8:07, the sunlight fell on a sketch that looked different from the others. Where Emma's other drawings were done in pencil, this one included small marks in what appeared to be invisible ink marks that only became visible under direct sunlight. "Clever girl," Martha murmured as the hidden message revealed itself. It was a map of the house, showing the location of something marked with a star in the basement, behind the water heater. The basement had been one area of the house that Jace had avoided exploring. It felt too intrusive, too much like grave robbing. But Emma's elaborate cipher suggested she had wanted someone to find whatever she'd hidden there. The basement was exactly what Jace had expected: concrete floors, exposed beams, the musty smell of 30 years without proper ventilation. The water heater sat in the far corner, a cylindrical monument to 1980s engineering that somehow still functioned. Behind it, exactly where Emma's map indicated, they found a loose stone in the foundation wall. Jace worked it free with his hands, revealing a cavity just large enough to hold a metal document tube, the kind photographers used to protect negatives. Inside the tube were architectural drawings unlike anything in Emma's journal. These weren't sketches or ideas. They were professional, quality blueprints for a water purification system that looked decades ahead of its time. Every component was labeled, every measurement precise, every angle calculated to the degree. But more importantly, tucked between the blueprints, they found a partially completed patent application. Emma had been trying to protect her invention legally, to ensure that her ideas could benefit the world, even if she wasn't there to oversee their development. The patent application was written in the careful language of legal documents, though Emma's youth showed through in places where her natural enthusiasm overcame formal constraints. She described her invention as a solar-powered water purification system designed to provide safe drinking water for children in underserved communities worldwide. The technical specifications were staggering. Emma's system could purify contaminated water at a rate of 50 gallons per day, using nothing but sunlight and a series of innovative filters she had designed herself. The projected cost per unit was less than $200, making it affordable for deployment in developing nations. "This is revolutionary," Martha said, studying the blueprints with growing amazement. "I mean, I knew Emma was brilliant, but this could save millions of lives." Jace found himself thinking about the weight of what they'd discovered. Emma's invention wasn't just clever, it was genuinely world-changing. And she had died before she could share it with anyone who might have the resources to make it real. That evening, after Martha had gone home with promises to research the patent process, Jace and Ollie sat in Emma's room, surrounded by the evidence of her remarkable mind. The music box played its coded melody in the background, a soundtrack to their growing understanding of the girl who had lived here. "Dad," Ollie said quietly, "what are we supposed to do with all this?" It was the question that had been haunting Jace since they'd found the journal. Emma had left behind ideas that could change the world, but she'd left them in the hands of a grieving father and a 10-year-old boy who were just trying to survive their own losses. "I don't know yet, buddy," Jace admitted, "but I think Emma wanted someone to find her work. Maybe that someone is us." Ollie picked up Emma's school photograph, studying her serious expression and intelligent eyes. She was trying to help people, even though she was just a kid. She was trying to help people because she was a kid. Jace corrected gently. "Sometimes children see solutions that adults miss because they haven't learned yet that some problems are supposed to be impossible to solve." As they prepared for bed that night, both father and son felt the weight of Emma's legacy settling around them like a mantle. They had come to this house looking for shelter and had found instead a purpose neither of them had expected. The music box continued to play its secret melody, filling the darkness with the promise that some gifts are too precious to remain buried forever. Martha returned the following Tuesday with an armload of research materials and the focused determination of a woman on a mission. She'd spent 2 days at the county library, the university library in the next town, and on the phone with patent attorneys who specialized in intellectual property law. "The good news," she announced as they gathered around the kitchen table, "is that Emma's patent application was never filed. That means her ideas are still protected under what's called prior art laws, and we could potentially complete the application process on her behalf." Jace felt his heart racing. "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that we need to prove the invention actually works. A patent isn't just about having a good idea. You have to demonstrate that the idea can be manufactured and will perform as promised." Ollie, who had been studying Emma's blueprints with increasing fascination, looked up from his careful examination of a filter design. "Could we build it? Could we actually make Emma's water cleaner?" Martha smiled at his enthusiasm. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. I spoke with Dr. Patricia Chen at State University. She runs the environmental engineering department, and she's agreed to look at Emma's designs. If they're as revolutionary as they appear to be, she might be willing to help us create a prototype." The drive to State University took 45 minutes through countryside that reminded Jace of better times, when he and Sarah had taken weekend trips to explore small towns and antique shops. Ollie sat in the back seat with Emma's blueprints carefully protected in a portfolio Martha had provided, treating them with the reverence of a monk transporting sacred texts. Dr. Chen's laboratory occupied an entire floor of the engineering building, filled with sophisticated equipment that made Emma's bedroom workshop look primitive by comparison. But when Dr. Chen examined Emma's blueprints, her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine amazement. "Where did you say these designs came from?" she asked, studying the filtration schematics with growing excitement. "A 12-year-old girl named Emma Hartwell," Jace replied. "She died 30 years ago, before she could finish her work." Dr. Chen looked up sharply. "A 12-year-old designed this? That's impossible. This level of engineering sophistication, the understanding of fluid dynamics, solar energy conversion, molecular filtration, this represents years of graduate-level study." Martha pulled out Emma's school photograph. She was what we used to call a child prodigy. Spent most of her free time at the library, reading scientific journals that most adults couldn't understand. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Chen examined every aspect of Emma's designs. She ran calculations, consulted reference materials, and made phone calls to colleagues who specialized in various aspects of water purification technology. "I need to be completely honest with you," she finally said. "These designs are not just viable, they're brilliant." Emma somehow intuited engineering principles that weren't even formally recognized until the late 1990s. Her solar energy conversion system is more efficient than anything currently on the market. Her filtration method combines multiple technologies in ways that no one has attempted. Jace felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Pride for Emma's extraordinary gifts, sadness that the world had lost such a remarkable mind before it could flourish. "More importantly," Dr. Chen continued, "I believe we can build this. My graduate students and I have been working on similar problems for years, but we've never approached the solution from this angle. Emma's design is elegant in ways that our more conventional approaches aren't." Ollie leaned forward eagerly. "So it would really work? It would really clean dirty water?" "Not just clean it," Dr. Chen replied. "According to these specifications, Emma's system would purify water to a standard that exceeds most municipal treatment plants, and it would do it using nothing but sunlight and filters that could be manufactured for less than $50 each." The implications hit Jace like a physical force. Emma's invention wasn't just clever, it was the kind of breakthrough that could legitimately change the world. And somehow, through a combination of desperation and chance, he and Ollie had become the custodians of her legacy. "What would it take to build a prototype?" Martha asked, always the practical librarian. Dr. Chen consulted her notes. 3 months, maybe 4. I'd need to secure funding for materials and graduate assistant time, but this is exactly the kind of project that attracts grant money. There are foundations specifically devoted to developing clean water technology for underserved populations. As they drove home, Ollie was unusually quiet. Jace caught his eye in the rearview mirror and saw the thoughtful expression that meant his son was processing something important. "What's on your mind, buddy?" "I keep thinking about Emma," Ollie said. "She was our age when she figured all this out. She was just a kid, but she was trying to save people." Jace pulled over at a roadside park and turned to face his son. "Does that inspire you or worry you?" "Both, I guess. I mean, I'm 10 and I can barely figure out my math homework. But Emma was 12 and she invented something that could help millions of people." Ollie looked down at the portfolio containing Emma's blueprints. "What if I'm supposed to do something important too, but I'm not smart enough?" The question broke Jace's heart and filled it simultaneously. He got out of the car and sat on the picnic table where Ollie had moved to watch the clouds. "You know what I think made Emma special?" Jace said finally. "It wasn't just that she was smart. Lots of people are smart. What made Emma extraordinary was that she cared about people she'd never met, kids on the other side of the world who needed clean water. She used her gifts to try to help others. But I don't have gifts like that." "Says who?" Jace smiled at his son. "You're the one who figured out that Emma's music box was playing the wrong notes. You're the one who noticed patterns in her drawings that Martha and I missed. You have your mother's heart and your own unique way of seeing the world." Ollie considered this. "Do you think Mom would have liked Emma?" The question caught Jace off guard, but as he thought about it, he realized the answer was obvious. She would have loved Emma. "Your mom always said that the most beautiful thing about children was their natural desire to make the world better." That evening, back in Emma's room, they made a decision that would change everything. Martha had left them with contact information for several foundations that funded clean water initiatives, along with a stack of grant applications and legal forms. "We're going to do this," Jace announced. "We're going to make Emma's invention real." Ollie looked up from Emma's journal, which he'd been reading like a bedtime story. "Even if it takes a long time? Even if it takes years? Emma deserves to have her work shared with the world, and there are children out there who need what she created." As they prepared for bed, Jace realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something that had been missing from their lives: purpose. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were working towards something meaningful, something that connected them to the brilliant girl who had lived in this house and dreamed of changing the world. The music box played its coded melody one more time before Jace closed the lid, its secret message now decoded, but its promise just beginning to unfold. 3 weeks into their collaboration with Dr. Chen, Ollie made a discovery that changed their understanding of Emma's story completely. He'd been methodically examining every inch of Emma's room, treating it like an archaeological site where each artifact might reveal crucial information about the girl who had lived there. It was while investigating a loose floorboard near Emma's desk that he found a collection of letters hidden in a small space between the joists. Unlike Emma's scientific journal, these letters were deeply personal, written in the voice of a lonely child, trying to make sense of a world that moved too fast for her extraordinary mind. "Dear future Emma," the first letter began, dated 2 years before her death. "I am writing this on my 10th birthday. Everyone gave me toys. But what I really wanted was someone to understand why I spend so much time thinking about problems that grown-ups say I'm too young to worry about." Jace read the letters aloud to Martha and Ollie that evening, his voice catching on passages that revealed Emma's profound isolation, despite her loving parents and comfortable home. "The other kids at school think I'm weird because I read science books during recess," one letter continued. "Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, keeps telling my parents that I need to act more like a normal child, but I don't know how to stop my brain from working the way it does. When I see pictures of children in other countries who are sick from dirty water, I can't stop thinking about it until I figure out how to help them." Another letter, written just months before her death, revealed the weight of Emma's growing awareness of her own mortality. "Dear future Emma, if you exist, I went to the doctor again today. Mum and Dad think I don't understand what the doctors are saying, but I do. I understand everything, and I know that I might not get to grow up the way other kids do. That's why I'm working so hard on the water purifier. If I can't live long enough to help people myself, maybe I can leave behind something that will help them after I'm gone." The letters painted a picture of a child who carried the concerns of the world on her shoulders, who felt responsible for solving problems that had challenged humanity for generations. But they also revealed Emma's deep capacity for love and her desperate wish for connection. "Sometimes I pretend that someday a family will move into our house and find all my work," she wrote in one of her final letters. "I pretend that they'll understand what I was trying to do and that they'll help me finish it. I know that's probably silly, but it makes me feel less alone when I'm working late at night on my projects." Ollie looked up from the letter with tears in his eyes. "Dad, she was writing to us. She knew we would come." Martha wiped her own eyes with a tissue. Children like Emma often have an intuitive understanding of things that adults miss. Maybe she did know, in some way, that her work would find the right people. The letters also provided crucial information about Emma's invention process. She described experiments conducted in secret, materials purchased with birthday money, and the growing urgency she felt as her health declined. Most importantly, she mentioned additional prototypes hidden in various locations around the house. "I built 3 different versions of the water purifier," one letter explained. "The first one is in my bedroom closet, behind the loose board. The second one is in the basement, next to my chemistry set. The third one is in the attic, inside an old suitcase. I wanted to make sure that if something happened to one of them, the others would survive." The hunt for Emma's prototypes became a family project that brought Martha, Jace, and Ollie together in ways that reminded Jace of better times. Martha approached it with a librarian's systematic methodology. Jace contributed his practical problem-solving skills, and Ollie provided the intuitive leap that often led them to exactly the right place. They found the first prototype exactly where Emma had described, shoebox-sized device constructed from PVC pipes, solar cells salvaged from a broken calculator, and filters that appeared to be made from household materials, but showed sophisticated understanding of molecular science. The basement prototype was more advanced, clearly representing months of refinement and improvement. Emma had somehow acquired professional-grade components, precision filters, high-efficiency solar panels, electronic monitoring systems that could have come from a commercial laboratory. How did a 12-year-old get access to this equipment? Dr. Chen wondered when they brought the prototypes to her laboratory for analysis. Martha had the answer. Emma's uncle worked for a water treatment company. I remember her mentioning that he would bring her samples of different filtration materials. He probably had no idea she was using them to build functional prototypes. But it was the third prototype, hidden in the attic suitcase, that took everyone's breath away. This wasn't a child's experiment or even an advanced student project. It was a fully functional water purification system that looked like it could have been manufactured commercially. "This is impossible," Dr. Chen muttered as she examined the device. The engineering tolerances, the component integration, the efficiency calculations, this represents a level of sophistication that most of my graduate students couldn't achieve. The attic prototype came with its own documentation, detailed test results, showing that Emma had purified water from the polluted creek behind her house, water from the municipal supply system, and even samples that she'd deliberately contaminated to test her system's limits. Every test showed the same result. Emma's invention produced water that exceeded all federal purity standards while using less energy than any existing system. "She really did it," Ollie whispered, staring at the test results. "She really solved the problem." But perhaps the most moving discovery in the attic was a final letter, sealed in an envelope marked, "For whoever finds my work." "If you are reading this," Emma had written, "it means that I didn't get to finish what I started. That makes me sad, but not as sad as you might think. I always knew that the most important inventions belong to everyone, not just to the people who create them." The letter continued, "I hope that whoever finds my water purifier will make it available to children who need clean water to survive. I hope they will remember that behind every invention is someone who cared enough about other people to spend their time trying to solve problems instead of just worrying about them." Emma ended with a request that broke everyone's heart. "If you use my invention to help people, please tell them that it came from a girl who wanted to make sure that no child ever died from something as simple as dirty water. Tell them that love can survive, even when the person who felt it cannot." That night, as they sat in Emma's room, surrounded by the evidence of her remarkable life, Martha made an observation that would stay with all of them. "You know," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what made Emma so special. It wasn't just her intelligence, though she was certainly brilliant. It was her empathy. She could imagine the suffering of children she'd never met, in places she'd never been, and that imagination drove her to work harder than any adult I've ever known." Jace looked at his son, who had spent the day carefully cataloguing Emma's prototypes with the same attention to detail that Emma herself had shown. "I think Emma's greatest invention wasn't the water purifier," he said. "I think it was the example she set, showing us that age doesn't matter when it comes to caring about others, that the best reason to use our gifts is to help people we'll never meet." As they prepared for bed, Ollie asked the question that had been haunting all of them. What happens now? What do we do with everything Emma left behind? Jace tucked the letters back into their hiding place with the same care that Emma had shown when she'd placed them there 3 decades earlier. "Now we keep the promise she asked us to make. We make sure her work reaches the children who need it." Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of the house that had sheltered Emma's dreams and now sheltered theirs. Inside, 3 people who had started as strangers were becoming a family united by the legacy of a girl whose greatest wish was simply to help others survive. The discovery that would unlock Emma's greatest secret came from the most mundane of sources. Ollie's natural curiosity about a jewelry box that sat on Emma's dresser, seemingly ordinary among her collection of scientific instruments and books. The jewelry box was carved from dark wood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl butterflies. It seemed out of place among Emma's technical possessions, more suited to a girl who collected dolls than one who designed water purification systems. But Ollie had learned that nothing in Emma's room was quite what it appeared to be. "There's something weird about this box," he told Jace one Saturday morning as they cleaned Emma's room together. "It's too heavy for jewelry, and listen." He shook it gently, producing a metallic rattle that didn't sound like rings or necklaces. When they opened the box, they found typical childhood treasures: few pieces of costume jewelry, some hair ribbons, a small collection of interesting rocks. But tucked beneath the red velvet lining was something that made Jace's heart skip: a small brass key attached to a ribbon with a note in Emma's handwriting. "The key to understanding everything is usually hidden in plain sight," the note read. "Look for the door that doesn't look like a door." The search for Emma's hidden door became an obsession that consumed their weekend. Martha joined them, bringing the systematic approach that had made her an excellent librarian. They examined every wall, every closet, every piece of furniture that might conceal a hidden entrance. It was Ollie who finally solved the puzzle, applying the same pattern recognition skills that had helped him decode Emma's music box cipher. He noticed that one section of basement wall was covered with wood paneling, while the rest was exposed, stoner detail that adult eyes had dismissed as typical basement renovation. "Dad, why would someone panel just this one section?" he asked, running his hands along the wood grain. "And look, these aren't real boards. They're painted to look like wood, but they're actually one big piece." The brass key fit perfectly into a lock, hidden behind a fake electrical outlet. When Jace turned it, they heard the soft click of a mechanism engaging, and the entire paneled section swung inward like a door. What they found beyond that door defied every assumption they'd made about Emma's capabilities. It was a laboratory, not a child's science corner, but a genuine research facility that would have impressed professional engineers. Emma had somehow converted a section of the basement into a workspace equipped with microscopes, chemical analysis equipment, precision measuring tools, and testing apparatus that must have cost thousands of dollars. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with prototypes in various stages of completion. Emma had built dozens of devices, not just water purifiers, but air filters, solar panels, chemical testing kits, and machines whose purposes weren't immediately obvious. Each prototype was labeled with careful documentation describing its function, its testing results, and its potential applications. "My God," Martha whispered, moving through the laboratory like a visitor in a shrine. "She built all of this herself?" The centerpiece of the laboratory was a complete water purification system, not a prototype, but a finished product that looked ready for commercial manufacturing. This wasn't the experimental device they'd found in the attic. This was Emma's final design, incorporating every lesson she'd learned from her earlier attempts. Dr. Chen, when they brought her to see the laboratory the following week, stood speechless for several minutes before finding her voice. "This is graduate-level work," she finally said. "This is beyond graduate-level work. Some of these innovations..." She picked up a filtration component that seemed impossibly compact for its complexity. "I've never seen anything like this." Emma wasn't just copying existing technology. She was inventing entirely new approaches to problems that have challenged scientists for decades. But the most remarkable discovery in Emma's laboratory wasn't any single invention. It was her documentation system. Emma had kept meticulous records of every experiment, every failure, every breakthrough. Her laboratory notebooks read like the research journals of a seasoned scientist, complete with hypotheses, methodologies, statistical analysis, and peer review protocols. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, opening one of Emma's later notebooks. "She's conducting double-blind testing on her own inventions. She's calculating confidence intervals. She's following research protocols that most professionals don't even know about." Emma's final notebook, dated just weeks before her death, contained entries that revealed both her extraordinary scientific maturity and her childlike hope for the future. "I know I'm running out of time," one entry began, "but I think I've finally perfected the water purifier design. The latest tests show 99.97% contaminant removal, energy efficiency that exceeds anything currently available, and manufacturing costs low enough to make the system affordable in developing nations." She continued, I've been thinking about what happens to all this work if I don't get better. Mom and Dad love me, but they don't understand what I've been doing down here. They think it's just a hobby, something to keep me busy while I'm sick. They don't realize that these inventions could actually save lives. The final entry in Emma's notebook was dated 3 days before the family's departure from the house. I've decided to leave everything exactly as it is. If something happens to me, maybe someday the right person will find this laboratory and understand what I was trying to accomplish. I've written instructions for manufacturing the water purifier and hidden them in the place where they'll be safest. Whoever finds my work, please remember that every invention represents hours I could have spent feeling sorry for myself, but chose instead to spend trying to help other people. That evening, as they sat in Emma's preserved bedroom, Jace realized that their small family had been entrusted with something far more significant than they'd initially understood. Emma hadn't just left behind clever inventions, she'd left behind a complete research program that could revolutionize clean water technology for millions of people. "The responsibility is enormous," he said to Martha and Ollie. "What if we make the wrong decisions? What if we can't live up to what Emma wanted to accomplish?" Martha, who had been quietly contemplating the implications of their discovery, offered the wisdom that comes from decades of helping people find answers to difficult questions. "Emma didn't leave her work to perfect people," she said. "She left it to people who cared enough to look for it, to understand its value, and to honor her memory by sharing it with the world. That's us, imperfect as we are." Ollie, who had been studying photographs of Emma's various prototypes, looked up with the kind of insight that reminded Jace daily of Sarah's intuitive wisdom. "I think Emma knew we would find her laboratory," he said. "I think she knew that someone like us people who needed help themselves would be the ones to understand why her inventions mattered so much." As they prepared to leave Emma's laboratory that night, carefully locking the door and returning the key to its hiding place in the jewelry box, they each understood that their lives had been permanently changed by a 12-year-old girl who had believed that love could survive even when the person who felt it could not. The laboratory hummed quietly in the darkness, Emma's inventions waiting patiently for the day when they would finally reach the children they had been designed to save. The revelation that would change everything came not from Emma's hidden laboratory or her scientific journals, but from a manila envelope that Martha discovered while researching Emma's family history at the county courthouse. "I wanted to find out more about Emma's parents," Martha explained when she arrived at the house the following Tuesday, her arms full of photocopied documents. "I thought it might help us understand how to honor Emma's memory properly if we knew more about the people who raised such an extraordinary child." What Martha had found among the public records was a file that painted a picture of a family struggling with circumstances far more complex than anyone had imagined. "Jace, Ollie," Martha said, her voice heavy with the weight of discovery. "I need to tell you something about Emma that changes everything we thought we knew about her story." They gathered in the living room, surrounded by the familiar artifacts of Emma's preserved childhood. But as Martha opened the manila envelope, the atmosphere in the room shifted from warm nostalgia to something far more profound. "Emma didn't just die from a rare disease," Martha began, pulling out a stack of medical records that had been filed as part of the family's insurance claim. "She died from juvenile myeloid leukemia, particularly aggressive form of blood cancer that primarily affects children between the ages of 10 and 15. Jace felt his stomach tighten. He knew enough about childhood leukemia to understand the implications. "The medical records show that Emma was diagnosed when she was 11, Martha continued. "But here's what's remarkable and heartbreaking. Emma knew her diagnosis. She understood her prognosis, and she made a conscious decision to spend what time she had left working on inventions that could help other children survive illnesses she knew she couldn't beat herself." Martha pulled out a letter written by Emma's oncologist to her parents, dated 6 months before Emma's death. "Emma is an extraordinary patient," the letter read. "Despite her youth, she has demonstrated an understanding of her condition that exceeds that of most adult patients. She has specifically requested that her treatment schedule be arranged to allow her maximum time for what she calls her work. While we typically encourage children to focus on normal childhood activities during treatment, Emma's dedication to her scientific projects appears to be providing her with a sense of purpose that may be contributing to her psychological resilience. The letter continued with details that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Emma has informed me that she is working on inventions designed to help children in developing countries who lack access to clean water and medical care. She has asked me to help her understand the medical challenges faced by children with waterborne illnesses, saying that she wants to make sure her inventions address real problems rather than theoretical ones. I have never encountered a child patient with such mature awareness of global health issues. But it was the next document that revealed the true scope of Emma's extraordinary courage. Martha pulled out a handwritten letter from Emma to her parents, found among her father's papers after his death several years earlier. "My dear Mom and Dad," the letter began, "I know you think I don't understand what's happening to me, but I do. I know that I have leukemia, and I know that the treatments aren't working the way the doctors hoped they would." Emma's letter continued with the wisdom of someone far older than her 12 years. "I'm not scared of dying, but I am scared of dying without leaving something useful behind. I've been reading about children in other countries who die from dirty water, and I realize that maybe I can help them even if I can't help myself. If I can invent a way to clean water that's simple and cheap enough for poor families to use, then maybe my life will have mattered for something important." The final paragraph of Emma's letter revealed the full depth of her sacrifice. "I know you want me to spend more time just being a kid, playing with friends and watching movies and doing normal things. But normal things feel empty when I know that other children are dying from problems I might be able to solve. Please let me keep working on my inventions. It's the only way I can feel like I'm fighting back against the unfairness of being sick." Martha wiped her eyes before continuing, "There's more. Emma's medical records show that she refused several treatment options that might have extended her life because they would have interfered with her cognitive abilities. She chose to remain clear-headed so she could continue working, even though it meant accepting a shorter survival time. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Emma hadn't been a child prodigy who happened to get sick. She had been a dying child who chose to spend her final months trying to save other children rather than extending her own life. "She gave up time," Ollie said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "She gave up her own time so she could help kids she would never meet." Martha nodded. "But there's something else, something that makes Emma's story even more remarkable." She pulled out a final documenter video cassette tape labeled "For Emma's Future Family" in careful handwriting. Emma's mother left this with their attorney before the family moved to California. Martha explained. The instructions were that it should be given to whoever eventually bought the house, but only if they seemed to genuinely care about Emma's memory. Martha had brought a small television and VCR from her own house. As she inserted the tape, the room filled with the soft static of analog recording. Then Emma's face appeared on the screen, not the serious school photograph they'd grown familiar with, but a living, breathing child with bright eyes and a gentle smile. "Hi," Emma said, her voice clear despite the obvious fatigue in her face. "If you're watching this, it means that someone special has moved into my house and found my work. My mum said she would make sure this tape got to the right people, and I trust her to know who that would be." Emma continued, speaking directly to them across 3 decades with the calm confidence of someone who had made peace with her fate. "I want you to know that everything I invented for you. Not for you specifically, because I don't know who you are, but for people like you, people who care about helping others, people who understand that the best reason to use your brain is to make life better for someone else." The video showed Emma in her hidden laboratory, demonstrating her water purification system with the expertise of a seasoned engineer. "I hope my inventions help children who need clean water," she said. "But more than that, I hope they help you understand that being sick doesn't mean being helpless." Some of the most important work in the world gets done by people who don't have very much time to do it. Emma's final message was addressed directly to any children who might find her work. If there are kids watching this, I want you to know that age doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. I was 12 when I figured out how to clean dirty water, and you might be even younger when you figure out how to solve a problem that adults have been struggling with for years. Don't let anyone tell you that you're too young to change the world. As the video ended with Emma waving goodbye, the three people sitting in her preserved living room understood that they had been chosen not just to preserve her memory, but to complete a mission that she had begun, with the full knowledge that she wouldn't live to see its conclusion. The house around them felt different, now not just a shelter they had stumbled into, but a sacred space where a dying child had worked to save other children's lives. Emma's inventions weren't just clever devices, they were love letters to a future she would never see, written in the language of science and sealed with the sacrifice of her remaining time. "What do we do now?" Jace asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now we keep the promise she made to children she would never meet," Martha replied. "We make sure Emma's love reaches everyone it was intended to reach." Emma's video message changed everything. What had begun as a quest to understand the mysterious girl who had lived in their house became a sacred mission to fulfill the dying wish of a child who had sacrificed her own time to save others. Dr. Chen arrived the next morning with a team of graduate students and enough equipment to conduct a comprehensive analysis of Emma's final prototype. The basement laboratory, which had remained Emma's secret for 30 years, suddenly bustled with the focused energy of scientists who recognized they were in the presence of something extraordinary. "I've been awake all night thinking about this," Dr. Chen told Jace as her students set up testing apparatus around Emma's water purification system. "If Emma's invention performs as well as her documentation suggests, we're not just looking at a clever device, we're looking at technology that could legitimately save millions of lives." The testing process took 3 days. Emma's prototype was subjected to every challenge that Dr. Chen's team could devise. They fed it water contaminated with bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, and chemical pollutants. They tested its efficiency under different weather conditions, with varying levels of sunlight, and with the kind of field conditions it would encounter in developing nations. Emma's invention passed every test. "The purification rate exceeds anything currently available," Dr. Chen announced as she reviewed the final results. "The energy efficiency is revolutionary. The manufacturing cost projections are accurate. Emma didn't just design a water purifier, she solved problems that major corporations have spent billions of dollars trying to address." But more than the technical specifications, it was Emma's thoughtful design choices that impressed the professional engineers. She had anticipated every challenge that users in remote locations might encounter, creating solutions for maintenance, repair, and replacement that could be handled by people with no technical training. "She designed this for love," one of Dr. Chen's graduate students observed. "Every component reflects an understanding not just of engineering principles, but of human needs." She thought about the mothers who would use this device, the children who would drink the water it produced, the communities that would benefit from its presence. With the testing complete, the next step was to approach organizations that could bring Emma's invention to the world. Martha had compiled a list of foundations, NGOs, and companies that specialized in clean water initiatives. Dr. Chen had reached out to colleagues at other universities who might provide additional validation and support. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Gates Foundation requested a full technical briefing. UNICEF wanted to discuss pilot programs in 3 African nations. The World Health Organization asked for detailed manufacturing specifications. Companies that specialized in humanitarian technology began competing for the opportunity to license Emma's design. "We need to be very careful about how we handle this," Martha warned during one of their evening planning sessions in Emma's room. "Emma's invention could be worth millions of dollars in patent licensing fees. We need to make sure that any money generated goes toward the purposes Emma intended." Jace had been thinking about this constantly. The financial implications of Emma's invention were staggering, not just for humanitarian organizations, but potentially for his own family. The patent licensing fees alone could provide financial security for Ollie's entire education and future. But every time he considered the money, he remembered Emma's video message and her letters to her future self. Emma hadn't invented the water purifier to create wealth. She had invented it to save children's lives. Any financial gain had to serve that primary purpose. "I think we need to establish a foundation," Jace announced. "Something that ensures Emma gets full credit for her invention, that directs any profits toward clean water initiatives, and that continues her work of supporting young inventors who want to help others." Ollie, who had been quietly drawing in one of Emma's sketchbooks, looked up with an idea that would prove to be the key to everything. "What if we make a video like Emma did?" he suggested. "What if we tell people Emma's story so they understand that the water purifier isn't just a machine eats, a gift from a kid who cared more about helping others than about living longer herself?" The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Emma's story was as powerful as her invention, and together they created a narrative that could inspire support for clean water initiatives worldwide. Martha contacted a local television producer who specialized in human interest stories. When the producer heard Emma's story and saw her laboratory, she immediately understood that this was more than just a news story. It was the kind of narrative that could change the way people thought about childhood, illness, and the power of love to transcend death. The filming took place over a week, with careful attention to preserving the dignity of Emma's memory while sharing the full scope of her extraordinary life. They interviewed Dr. Chen about the technical innovations Emma had achieved. They spoke with representatives from humanitarian organizations about the global need for affordable water purification technology. They filmed Ollie and Jace in Emma's laboratory, surrounded by the inventions she had created while fighting for her life. But the most powerful moment came when they played Emma's own video message, letting her speak for herself about her motivations and her hopes for the future. "This isn't just about technology," the producer said as she reviewed the footage. "This is about the triumph of love over despair, about a child who chose to spend her final months creating rather than complaining, about the way extraordinary courage can emerge from ordinary-looking people." As the documentary neared completion, Jace realized that his family had been transformed by their connection to Emma's story. Ollie had found his voice and his purpose, channeling his grief over losing his mother into determination to honor Emma's memory. Martha had discovered a new chapter of meaning in her retirement, becoming the guardian of Emma's legacy and an advocate for young inventors everywhere. And Jace himself had learned that healing sometimes comes not from forgetting loss, but from transforming it into service to others. The night before the documentary was scheduled to air nationally, they held a private screening in Emma's living room. As they watched Emma's story unfold on screen, as they heard her own words explaining her inventions and her dreams, they understood that they had become part of something far larger than their own survival. "She knew," Ollie said quietly as the documentary ended. "Emma knew that someday people would understand what she was trying to do." Martha nodded, wiping away tears she had shed many times over the past months. She also knew that the right people would find her work and carry it forward. She trusted in the future even when she couldn't be part of it. Jace looked around the room where Emma had lived and dreamed and worked, where she had chosen love over self-pity and service over despair. Tomorrow, her story would reach millions of people. Her invention would begin its journey to the children who needed it most. Her example would inspire other young people to believe that age is no barrier to making a difference in the world. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of the house that had saved them all, three people who had started as strangers sat together as family, united by the legacy of a girl who had believed that love could survive even when the person who felt it could not. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows, but inside, Emma's spirit filled every corner with the warmth of a life lived in service to others, a gift that would keep giving long after the giver had been called home. The documentary aired on a Tuesday evening in February, exactly 4 months after Jace and Ollie had first walked through the doors of 1247 Sycamore Street. What happened next exceeded every expectation they had dared to form. Within hours of the broadcast, the phone calls began. Not just from journalists and television producers, but from engineers who wanted to help manufacture Emma's invention, from humanitarian organizations ready to fund pilot programs, and from families whose own children had been inspired by Emma's example. Dr. Chen called at midnight, her voice trembling with excitement. "Jace, you need to know what's happening. I've been in touch with colleagues around the world, and the response to Emma's invention is unprecedented. The World Health Organization wants to fast-track approval for field testing. 3 major manufacturing companies are competing to produce the units at cost. The Gates Foundation is talking about funding 1 million units for immediate deployment." But it was Martha who delivered the news that changed everything. "The patent office called," she announced the next morning, her hands shaking as she held the phone. "Emma's patent application has been expedited for approval. Once it's finalized, every water purification unit manufactured using her design will bear her name and generate licensing fees for the foundation we're establishing. The Emma Hartwell Foundation, as they had decided to call it, would receive funding not just from patent licensing, but from donations inspired by Emma's story." Within a week of the documentary's airing, contributions had exceeded $50,000 from viewers who wanted to support clean water initiatives in Emma's memory. Ollie had become the unofficial spokesperson for Emma's legacy, his natural eloquence and genuine emotion making him the perfect ambassador for her story. When reporters asked him what Emma would think about the response to her invention, his answer always brought tears to everyone's eyes. "I think she would be happy that people understand why she worked so hard," he would say. "She didn't want to be famous, just wanted kids to have clean water. Now they will, because of what she invented when she was just 12 years old." The technical validation came from sources that carried weight throughout the scientific community. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology requested Emma's original prototypes for permanent display in their Museum of Innovation. The Smithsonian wanted to create an exhibit about child inventors, with Emma's story as the centerpiece. Most importantly, field tests began in 3 locations where clean water access was critically needed. Engineers traveled to rural villages in Kenya, Guatemala, and Bangladesh, carrying Emma's water purification units and the hope that her invention would perform in real-world conditions as brilliantly as it had in laboratory testing. The results exceeded every projection Emma had made in her notebooks. "The units are working perfectly," reported Dr. Sarah Kim, the engineer overseeing the Kenya deployment. "Local families can operate them with minimal training. The maintenance requirements are exactly what Emma projected. Most importantly, the water quality tests show purification levels that exceed international standards. But it was the human impact that truly validated Emma's vision. In Guatemala, a village that had lost 3 children to waterborne illness in the previous year, reported 0 cases of water-related sickness in the 2 months following deployment of Emma's system. In Bangladesh, a school that had been forced to close regularly due to contaminated water supplies was able to maintain full attendance for the first time in years. The photographs that came back from the field deployments showed something that even Emma's extensive planning hadn't fully anticipated. The units weren't just providing clean water, they were bringing communities together. Families gathered around the purification systems, children helped with maintenance, and the devices became focal points for community pride and cooperation. "Emma designed more than a machine," observed Dr. Chen as she studied reports from all 3 deployment sites. "She designed a tool for community building. The units required just enough cooperation and maintenance to give people ownership over their clean water supply without being so complex that they become burdensome." The patent approval came through on a Friday afternoon in March, exactly 6 months after Jace had bought the house for $800. Martha called from the courthouse where she had been monitoring the paperwork, her voice filled with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. "It's official," she announced. "Emma Catherine Hartwell is now the youngest person ever to receive a posthumous patent for a humanitarian technology invention. Every unit manufactured will bear her name, and the licensing fees will fund clean water projects worldwide through the Emma Hartwell Foundation." That evening, as they celebrated in Emma's preserved dining room, Jace realized that his family had been transformed by their connection to her story. Ollie had found his voice and his purpose, speaking about Emma's work with the passion of someone who understood that age is no barrier to making a difference. Martha had discovered a new chapter of meaning in her life, becoming an advocate for young inventors and the guardian of Emma's legacy. And Jace himself had learned that healing comes not from forgetting loss, but from transforming it into service to others. Sarah's death had broken his heart, but Emma's example had shown him how to use that brokenness to understand the suffering of others and work to alleviate it. The financial projections for the Emma Hartwell Foundation were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that patent licensing fees alone would generate over $2 million annually, with deployment funding from major humanitarian organizations potentially reaching 10 times that amount. But more than the money, it was the knowledge that Emma's invention would save lives that filled their house with a sense of completion. Somewhere in the world, children were drinking clean water because of the work a 12-year-old girl had done while fighting for her own life. Parents would not lose their children to preventable illnesses because Emma had chosen to spend her final months inventing rather than grieving. As they prepared for bed that night, Ollie asked the question that had been haunting all of them since the patent approval. "Do you think Emma knows?" he asked. "Do you think she knows that her invention is helping kids?" Jace looked around the dining room, where Emma had once sat doing homework that would change the world, where her parents had watched their brilliant daughter work with the intensity of someone who knew time was running out. "I think Emma always knew," he replied. "I think she knew that love finds a way to survive, even when the person who felt it cannot." The ceremony took place on a warm Saturday morning in May, exactly 1 year after Jace and Ollie had first walked through Emma's front door. The town of Millbrook had chosen to honor Emma's legacy with a memorial plaque in the town square. But what had started as a simple dedication had grown into something far more significant. Over 300 people gathered in the square that morning, not just local residents, but representatives from humanitarian organizations, scientists who had studied Emma's work, families whose children had benefited from her invention, and young inventors who had been inspired by her example. The bronze plaque, mounted on a granite stone near the town's old fountain, bore Emma's photograph and an inscription that captured the essence of her extraordinary life. Emma Catherine Hartwell, 1980. 1993, child inventor and humanitarian. Her water purification system has provided clean drinking water to over 100 children worldwide. She believed that love could survive even when the person who felt it could not. Her example proves that age is no barrier to changing the world. But it was the speeches that day that truly honored Emma's memory. Dr. Chen spoke about the technical brilliance of Emma's inventions, explaining to the crowd how a 12-year-old girl had solved engineering problems that had challenged professionals for decades. Martha shared stories about Emma's regular visits to the library, her insatiable curiosity, and her determination to use her intelligence in service of others. Representatives from UNICEF and the World Health Organization provided updates on the global deployment of Emma's water purification systems. In the year since the documentary had aired, over 0 units had been manufactured and distributed to communities in 37 countries. The technology that Emma had perfected in her basement laboratory was now saving lives on 6 continents. But it was Ollie's speech that brought tears to every eye in the crowd. "A year ago, my dad and I had lost everything," he began, his voice clear and confident despite his young age. "We were sleeping in our car, and I thought our lives were over. Then we found Emma's house, And we found Emma's story, and we learned something important. Sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually in the exact right place to find what you're supposed to do with your life. Ollie continued, speaking directly to the children in the audience. Emma was only 12 when she invented something that's now helping kids all over the world have clean water. She was sick, and she knew she didn't have very long to live, but instead of feeling sorry for herself, she spent her time trying to help other people. That's the most grown-up thing anyone can do, no matter how old they are. He concluded with words that would be quoted in newspapers and remembered long after the ceremony ended. Emma taught us that you don't have to be big to make a big difference. You don't have to be old to do important work. You just have to care about other people more than you care about yourself. If a sick 12-year-old girl could change the world, then any of us can. After the formal ceremony, people lingered in the square, sharing stories about Emma's impact on their lives. Parents spoke about children who had been inspired to pursue science after hearing Emma's story. Teachers described students who had started their own invention projects, determined to follow Emma's example of using their talents to help others. But perhaps the most moving moment came when a family from Kenya approached Jace and Ollie with a photograph. It showed their 8-year-old daughter standing beside one of Emma's water purification units, holding a glass of clean water and smiling with the joy of a child who understood she was safe. "This is our daughter, Amara," the father explained through tears. 2 years ago, she almost died from drinking contaminated water. Now, because of Emma's invention, she is healthy and strong. We wanted you to know that Emma's love reached our family, even though our daughter will never meet the girl who saved her life. The photograph joined the collection that had been growing on Emma's bedroom wall images sent from around the world by families whose children had benefited from her invention. Each photograph represented lives saved, communities strengthened, and hope restored in places where clean water had once seemed impossible to obtain. That evening, as the crowds dispersed and Millbrook returned to its usual quiet rhythm, Jace, Ollie, and Martha sat in Emma's living room, surrounded by letters and photographs from people whose lives had been touched by her legacy. "Do you think we did right by her?" Jace asked, voicing the question that had haunted him throughout their journey. "Do you think Emma would be proud of what we've accomplished?" Martha, who had become the keeper of Emma's memory and the guardian of her values, smiled with the confidence of someone who had known Emma personally and understood her heart. "Emma never wanted to be famous," she replied. "She wanted to help children. Today, over 100 children have access to clean water because of her invention. Thousands more have been inspired to use their own talents to help others. Emma's love has reached further than she ever could have imagined." Ollie, who had grown from a quiet, grieving boy into a confident young advocate for humanitarian innovation, added his own perspective. "I think Emma would be happiest knowing that her story is helping other kids believe they can make a difference. Every time someone hears about what she did and decides to help someone else, Emma's love keeps growing." As night fell over the house at 1247 Sycamore Street, the three people who had been brought together by Emma's legacy reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with an $800 gamble and led to a global movement inspired by a 12-year-old girl's determination to help others. The memorial plaque in the town square would weather and fade over the decades, but Emma's true monument was built from something more enduring than bronze or granite. It was constructed from the lives she had saved, the communities she had strengthened, and the hearts she had touched with her example of selfless love. Her invention would continue working in villages around the world, long after everyone who remembered her personally had passed away. But more than that, her story would continue inspiring young people to believe that age is no barrier to changing the world, that love is stronger than death, and that the greatest gift anyone can give is the decision to use their talents in service of others. In the end, Emma Hartwell had achieved the immortality that every parent hopes for their child, not the immortality of fame or fortune, but the immortality that comes from making the world a better place for those who come after us. 2 years later, On a crisp autumn morning that reminded Jace of the day he'd first bought the house, he stood in Emma's former laboratory, watching his son put the finishing touches on his latest invention. The basement that had once held Emma's secret work now served as headquarters for the Emma Hartwell Foundation's Young Inventors Program, where children from around the world came to develop their own solutions to humanitarian problems. Ollie, now 12 the same age Emma had been when she'd perfected her water purification system, was working on a device he'd designed to help children with mobility challenges navigate rough terrain in developing countries. His invention combined Emma's elegant engineering principles with his own understanding of what it meant to need help when the world seemed determined to knock you down. "Dad, look at this," Ollie called out, his voice filled with the excitement that Jace had learned to associate with breakthrough moments. "I figured out how to make the wheels adapt automatically to different surfaces. It's based on something Emma wrote about in her notebooks, the idea that the best inventions anticipate problems before they happen." Jace smiled, watching his son work with the same focused intensity that Emma had shown in her final months. But unlike Emma, Ollie had time to experiment, time to fail and try again, time to collaborate with other young inventors who shared his commitment to using intelligence in service of others. The house at 1247 Sycamore Street had been transformed while preserving everything that made it sacred. Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, but the rest of the house had become a living memorial to her vision. The dining room served as a conference space where humanitarian organizations planned deployment strategies for new inventions. The living room hosted visiting families whose children had benefited from Emma's water purification systems and wanted to thank her memory in person. Martha, now officially the Foundation's Director of Youth Programs, had moved into the house to help manage the constant stream of visitors, volunteers, and young inventors who came to study Emma's work and develop their own projects. At 78, she had found a second career that fulfilled her in ways that 42 years of library work had never quite achieved. "We received the quarterly report from the field deployments," Martha announced as she entered the laboratory with a stack of photographs and letters. Emma's water purification systems are now operating in 63 countries. The latest count shows over 300 people with access to clean water because of her invention. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of Emma's story. The letters that arrived daily at the Foundation painted a more complete picture of her legacy's impact. Parents wrote to thank Emma for saving their children's lives. Teachers described students inspired by her example to pursue careers in science and engineering. Young inventors shared their own projects, always crediting Emma's story with teaching them that age was no barrier to making a difference. One letter had particularly moved everyone at the Foundation. It came from a 15-year-old girl in Bangladesh whose village had received one of Emma's water purification units 3 years earlier. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I know you died a long time ago, but I wanted to tell you that your invention saved my little brother's life. Before your water cleaner came to our village, many children got sick from dirty water. My brother almost died when he was only 4 years old." The letter continued, "Now I am studying engineering so I can invent things like you did. My teacher says I am good at solving problems, and I want to use that gift to help other children the way you helped my brother. Thank you for showing me that girls can be inventors, and that the best reason to be smart is to help other people." Stories like these arrived weekly, each one a testament to the ripple effects of Emma's choice to spend her final months creating rather than grieving. Her water purification systems had not only saved lives, they had inspired a generation of young people to believe that they could change the world through innovation and compassion. The Emma Hartwell Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The patent licensing fees, combined with donations from around the world, now funded clean water projects, youth inventor programs, and educational initiatives in over 40 countries. Major corporations competed for the opportunity to manufacture products using Emma's designs, with all profits directed toward humanitarian purposes. But perhaps the Foundation's most important work was its annual Young Inventors Fair, held each year in Millbrook on the anniversary of Emma's death. Children from around the world gathered to present their own inventions designed to help others, following Emma's example of using intelligence and creativity in service of humanitarian goals. This year's fair had attracted over 200 young inventors, ranging in age from 8 to 18. Their projects addressed problems Emma would have understood: devices to help children with disabilities, systems to provide clean water in remote locations, technologies to improve education in underserved communities. Jace walked through the fair each year with a mixture of pride and amazement, watching children who had never heard of Emma until they learned about the Foundation, carrying forward her vision with their own innovations. These young inventors didn't just admire Emma's technical brilliance, they had internalized her understanding that the greatest inventions are born from love for people you may never meet. As evening approached on this anniversary day, Jace and Ollie made their way to Emma's bedroom for their annual tradition of reading her letters and looking through the photographs that had accumulated over the years. The room remained exactly as Emma had left it, but it no longer felt like a shrine to interrupted dreams. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a story that was still being written by every child whose life had been saved by her invention, and every young person inspired by her example. "Dad," Ollie said as they settled onto the floor beside Emma's preserved desk, "do you think Emma knew that her story would inspire so many other kids to become inventors?" Jace considered the question, thinking about the girl who had hidden her work so carefully, who had written letters to a future she wouldn't see, who had trusted that someday the right people would find her laboratory and understand its significance. "I think Emma knew that love finds a way to multiply," he replied. "She couldn't have predicted exactly how her story would unfold, but she trusted that caring about others creates more caring, that one person's choice to help can inspire countless others to help as well." As they prepared for bed, Jace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years earlier, he and Ollie had been desperate, homeless, and convinced that their lives had been destroyed by loss. Now they lived in a house filled with purpose, surrounded by a global community united by Emma's example, working each day to ensure that her legacy continued growing. The Emma Hartwell Foundation's work would continue long after Jace and Ollie were gone. Emma's water purification systems would keep providing clean water for generations. Her story would keep inspiring young people to believe that they could change the world. Her example would keep proving that love is stronger than death, that the greatest gifts come from the decision to serve others, and that even the briefest lives can cast shadows that stretch across decades. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees that surrounded 1247 Sycamore Street, carrying with it the laughter of children who had gathered to honor a girl they had never met, but whose love had reached them across time and space. Inside, a father and son, who had been saved by Emma's legacy, prepared for sleep in the house that had taught them the most important lesson of all. Sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually in exactly the right place to find what you're supposed to do with the rest of your life. Emma's music box played its coded melody one more time before Jace closed the lid. Its secret message now shared with the world, but its promise still unfolding in ways that would have amazed even the brilliant girl who had composed it. Her love had survived, just as she had trusted it would, growing stronger with each life it touched and each heart it inspired to care about others. The house settled into peaceful quiet, but Emma's work continued in laboratories and villages around the world, carried forward by people who understood that the greatest inventions are not just clever solutions to technical problems, but expressions of love for humanity itself.